bright, decent people. The Arbs were Bob Rubin, of Goldman Sachs, and Bunny Lasker, of Lasker, Stone and Stern. And they were honest, and if they thought they had inside information they'd call and ask. And if we said yes, then they'd freeze their position. And the clients were people like Larry Tisch going after CNA, or big companies going after other big companies, because they believed they could run them better. Now it's the Icons and the Jacobses and the Pickenses and the Peltzes and the Perelmans. And, this participant continued, displaying the paranoid-sounding mindset that the junk bond wars had induced, we have to have detectives in to make sure our rooms aren't bugged and our phone lines aren't tapped, and that they aren't sending electronic beams into our offices, and we have to look for hidden cameras when we go into and out of meetings. They have ruined my life. You feel like you're in the gutter, like they're piling shit on you and you have to keep struggling to get up from it. And it's all been made possible by Drexel. Without Drexel, none of it could have happened. While Revlon's defenders mourned, the Blue Team celebrated. When the deal closed in early November, Perelman hosted a dinner for 30 aides, lawyers and investment bankers at Le Club, an exclusive Manhattan night spot. Perelman's favorite champagne, Crystal, FL owed freely, and some of the key players put on a skit which, in the continuing color war motif, was referred to as the Songfest. It opened with the Phi RST Perelman-Bergerac encounter, in June, '85. Dennis Levine played Bergerac, dressed as a big game hunter, mimicking his French accent, calling Perelman an upstart and a Jew from Philadelphia. Engel played Perelman. Wearing Gucci loafers and one of his $3,000 Fiorentino custom-tailored suits, he fondled and puffed a fat Macanudo cigar and dropped its ashes on Bergerac's rugs. When Bergerac, Levine, offered Perelman, Engel, some Chateau Lafite, Perelman asked for vodka. Peasant, snorted Bergerac. There was plenty to celebrate for those on hand that night. Perelman had gotten the company of his dreams, though not for free, as he had originally planned. Its real cost would not become clear for some time, until the divestitures were completed. But for most of these merrymakers, particularly the lawyers and the investment bankers, the bust-up of Revlon had already spouted geysers of gold. Fees paid to lawyers and investment bankers in this deal came to over $100 million. Making it the most lucrative takeover yet. Even the $13.40 billion acquisition of Gulf Oil Corporation by Standard Oil, instigated by Pickens, threw off only $60 million in fees. Revlon's legal bill, from Wachtell, Lipton and Paul Weiss, is estimated at about $10 million, while Pantry Pride's from Skadden, Arps is estimated at $7-8 million. Fried, Frank, Harris and Shriver, representing Forstmann Little, was paid at least $1 million. But as is always the case, the investment banker's take makes the lawyers seem modest by comparison, though the bankers typically have far fewer people working on any deal than the lawyers do. Goldman Sachs & Company received about $3 million from Forstmann Little. Lazard Frères received about $11 million from Revlon. Morgan Stanley, once all the divestitures were done, received under $25 million, far less than the $30 million that had been established as their ceiling. In fact, Drexel had tried to persuade Perelman to ditch Morgan Stanley when they refused to put their name on the tender offer. And Drexel continued to argue that all Morgan Stanley deserved was its fee for having brought Perelman the idea. Not surprisingly, Drexel claimed the lion's share, over $65 million. In its July public offering of $750 million of Pantry Pride notes, Drexel received an underwriting discount, or fee, of about 3.5%, which equaled $25 million. It received another $11 million as an advisory fee. And then it received on its private placement of $770 million about $30 million. Moreover, when McAndrews and Forbes made its purchase of 37.6% of Pantry Pride stock for $60 million in the spring of '85, Drexel-related entities known as Prime Capital Associates had bought $10 million worth of that stock on the same terms as McAndrews. This stock was distributed, as such extras always are, to those whom Milken favored: himself, his people, some of the key individuals in corporate finance. Engel was one of those in Prime Capital Associates. Revlon's most senior executives lost their jobs, though they did not walk away empty-handed. Golden parachutes totaling $42.20 million were paid out to 13 executives. $15 million of this went to Bergerac's own parachute, the largest ever given. In addition, he received 5 years of salary and bonus, valued at about $7 million, and stock options and accelerated payment of restricted stock worth $13 million. In all, his severance package came to $35 million. Revlon's shareholders also did well. The stock was trading in the low 30s before the Pantry Pride rumors drove it up, and Pantry Pride paid $58 per share in the end. Immediately after the argument in Chancery Court but before Justice Walsh wrote his opinion, Pantry Pride had raised its bid from $56.25 to $58. Pantry Pride shareholders were not left out. That stock was trading at about 3 3/4 before Perelman took control of the company in the spring of 1985. Less than a year later it had tripled. And those who signed up for the bonds and bought them but wanted to trade out quickly also Professor I. Ted. One of the buyers said that over a period of several months, starting before Perelman announced his offer, but when the company was known to be in play, he had accumulated about $16 million of Revlon stock. When Drexel called to sell him the bonds, therefore, he had a powerful interest in seeing the deal go through. He sold his stock for about $18 million, he says, and then put that money up for the bonds at an interest rate of 13.75%, plus his commitment fee of 0.75%. The deal closed in mid-November, and within 2 weeks there were reports that Revlon was going to sell its Norcliffe Thayer Health Products and Rehees Special Chemical businesses to the Beecham Group of Britain for about $400 million, and its ethical drug division to Rohrer for over $600 million. Both deals were announced by the first week of December. Some onlookers were puzzled by the speed with which the Rohrer deal, particularly, was done, and by the absence of an auction. Howard Gittes, however, explained, they had an exclusive. Well, almost an exclusive. We said, if we get the company, and you commit to us now, then we won't shop the deal. This agreement should arguably have been disclosed in SEC filings if it was indeed made during the course of the deal. When later asked to comment, Gittes denied that anyone had been given an exclusive. At that point, in December, the money was just sitting there in the bank, but they couldn't buy back the bonds for 6 months, this buyer said. So it was completely safe now, good for the S&Ls, and Milken wanted the bonds back. That suited him, he added, because he wanted to get his money out. And he was eager to be a team player so that Milken would come back to him in the next deal. This is the same kind of movement of the bonds, out of the hands of a high-rolling buyer into those of the more reticent thrifts, insurance companies and pension funds, that took place in Triangle National Can. Here the high-risk, private buyers were freed to go on to the next megadeal, which in December was GAF Union Carbide, while the more risk-averse but still hungry players could be fed. The only dissonant note in this chorus of happy Professor I tears came, as is usual in these transactions, from the bondholders of the acquired company who found their paper suddenly downgraded now that the company was so debt-laden. Their prices, however, have since rebounded. This illustrated the gospel according to Milken, which proselytized that while low-grade bonds might be upgraded, high-grade could go only one way, down. Of course, when he FIRST started spreading that gospel, he had been speaking as an observer. Now, many years later, as Milken's raiders menaced companies which did defensive restructurings and then had their bonds downgraded, or acquired companies whose bonds were subsequently downgraded, he was often the propulsive force. According to Drexel, in 1985 $4.06 billion of junk bonds moved up into the investment grade category, while $9.10 billion of investment grade moved down into the netherworld of junk. 1 year after the Blue Team had had its high-spirited bash at Le Club, Perelman was still on the move. In October 1986 he had made a run at CPC International, the food processing company, and had then sold his stake to Solomon Brothers for a Professor IT of $41 million, in a trade which a Wall Street Journal, heard on the street, column suggested was pre-arranged, artificially infl aided, and, if so, Perelman's FIRST, albeit disguised, green mailing. By early November, Perelman had accumulated 15% of the stock of Transworld Corporation, a restaurant, hotels and food service conglomerate. Transworld then decided to liquidate, but Perelman got the option of buying its prize, Hilton International Company, for $1 billion. That option aside, in 1 month he had achieved on his $223 million Transworld investment a paper Professor IT of $55 million. On November 14, he offered $4.10 billion in cash, with Drexel's highly conference ident endorsement, for the Gillette Company, the razor blade manufacturer. Perelman was thriving as a predator. But whether the Revlon acquisition, which had raised him from an obscure, small-time entrepreneur to a corporate mogul, would in fact turn out to be the world-class company that he envisioned was less clear. He had purchased Revlon shares for about $1.80 billion, assumed debt of roughly $1 billion, and had expenses and carrying costs that brought his total acquisition cost to about $3 billion. He had sold several of the healthcare businesses for a total of roughly $1.40 billion. He had kept National Health Labs and Vision Care, whose value at the time of the acquisition, though it has since gone up, was probably about $1.20 billion. Therefore, Perelman had not acquired the cosmetics business for free, as he had initially planned, but for roughly $400 million. And Revlon's contract to sell the cosmetics business to Adler and Shakin, for a price that Perelman puts at $780 million, not $900 million, ended in litigation that cost Perelman $23.70 million to settle. By year-end 1987, Perelman would augment the cosmetics business, making it the world's largest, by buying Max Factor, Charles of the Ritz and Germain Monteil for more than $500 million. According to Revlon, operating Professor ITS for 1987 would double what they had been in 1985. Drapkin, who announced in October, '86 that he was leaving Skadden, Arps, where he had been earning well over $1 million a year, to join Perelman as a vice chairman of Revlon Group. Revlon was merged into Pantry Pride, which then changed its name to Revlon Group, Inc., predicted at that time that Ronnie is going to turn cosmetics around. I doubt very much that he'll ever sell Revlon. I think he sees it as the cornerstone of an empire. Others are less rhapsodic. It will be a tough struggle, very tough, says one established figure in the industry. Too much damage has been done. I don't know any cosmetics image that has ever been resurrected. Many questioned the wisdom of Perelman's having brought Saul Levine, a protégé of Charles Revson and former consultant, whom Bergerac had let go, back into the company as its president. Bergerac had let Levine go because he considered him wanting. Bergerac, as was to be expected, is foremost among the doomsayers. He is convinced that Perelman was seduced by the glamour of the beauty business, and that it will be his undoing. Cosmetics was worth $500 million at best, he declared. But instead of taking the $900 million for it from Adler and Shakin, he got good to average prices for selling the healthcare businesses, which were running like a clock, generating enormous professor ITS. So he got rid of the good and kept the bad. That would be at odds with what Perelman had managed to do in most of his earlier, smaller acquisitions. But the cosmetics business was in itself a break with Perelman's past targets. Drexel's Abecassis admitted, Revlon does have a phi-ckle aspect to it that Ronnie's other acquisitions didn't have. They didn't have to depend on sophisticated selling. In Revlon, you're selling dreams, so it's a different story. He's done some things at Revlon, cutting expenses, consolidating. But it's certainly not done yet, not by any means. And the measures he's taken aren't going to improve the business in the long run. Abecassis believes that Revlon could benefit from Perelman's full attention, but the peripatetic Perelman does not see it that way. His attitude is, he came in, he cleaned it up, he's ready to go on to the next, Abecassis added. It worked with FL Avors, McAndrews, it worked with Technicolor, but here it's different. I told him this, just the other day. He said, what am I supposed to do? Sit here and look at the business every day? Ronnie is a deal person, Abecassis concluded. He wants to do deals. Given that, it is not surprising that Perelman changed the plan he and Milken had agreed upon, that he would sell off the pieces of Revlon and pay down most, if not all, of the junk acquisition debt. Instead, Perelman refinanced those notes. According to one member of the UAC, Underwriting Assistance Committee, some of its members thought that Perelman should pay down the debt, but they were overruled by others. As for Milken's view on Perelman's keeping the cash, Abecassis said, Mike is a trader. He has the view, you go in and out. And he's a hungry guy. So he doesn't say, stop. Also, he trusts Ronnie. According to Abecassis, if the Transworld deal had gone through, Perelman would have had to give up, to Drexel, which would probably have distributed some to bond buyers, 30% of the equity. Ronnie doesn't want to give any equity, but if he doesn't, there's no deal. In Revlon, he gave Drexel warrants in Pantry Pride, and it was not that much equity. That was really a way of paying our fee. We fought. We told Ronnie next time he would have to give equity. By fall '86, Perelman was still dependent on Drexel for the multi-billion-dollar deals he craved. In Transworld, which would have been a $2.50 billion deal, Perelman had no other recourse, Abecassis insisted. You may not be able to sell assets, you need long-term money. And the banks won't do it. I went to a meeting yesterday. The bank, are nervous about $400 million, when we have $1.90 billion below them, subordinated to the bank's senior, secured debt. While it was not yet clear whether Perelman would succeed in resurrecting Revlon, its acquisition had certainly done wonders for his social climbing. Almost everyone who knows Perelman has a story to tell about his eagerness for that ascent, which dates back to his Philadelphia days, when he was rebuffed by that city's social elite, and for the company of the famous. He had on the payroll of Technicolor a consultant, named Dennis Stein, known for his brief engagement to Elizabeth Taylor, who, as one associate says, is a high-class golfer. Stein's apparent function, this associate says, was to introduce Perelman to celebrities, though with Taylor's departure it became less viable. A few months after taking over Revlon, Perelman hired a well-connected editor from Town and Country magazine, Nancy Gardiner, to be his social secretary. And he brought Ann Getty onto the Revlon board. Ronnie is determined to have a glitzy board, commented another of his associates. As reported by Spy magazine, Jacqueline Onassis, Halston, Caroline Herrera and Calvin Klein have been to the Perelman's East 63rd Street townhouse for parties. And Perelman would become the honorary chairman at one of the most socially acceptable and literati filled benefits of the year, for the New York Public Library. Referring to all the gossip about Perelman's eagerness to gain entrée to the rarefied social realm, Bergerac says, with an acid chuckle, Teddy Forstmann had the best line of all. This has got to be the highest price ever paid in the history of this country to get a good table at a New York restaurant. In September, '86, in the opulent Revlon off ICES where he and the Drexels had arrived as hated interlopers and dropped ashes on Bergerac's Persian rugs, Perelman now seemed at home. He and Drapkin had liked calling attention to Bergerac's excesses, particularly the Boeing 727 Outef ITTED with a gun rack for his safaris, and the Revlon off ICES in Paris which Perelman described as a castle. Now the company leased its corporate jet from a Perelman aircraft leasing company. And now that the castle was his Paris headquarters, Perelman had decided not to sell it, after all. He was having the New York off ICES redecorated. And James, Bergerac's butler, was now serving Perelman. Moreover, while Bergerac's $35 million parachute had elicited from Perelman and Drapkin a mutual outrage BEFITTING, two sign-bearers of the corporate revolution, the terms of Drapkin's employment would be far richer than any that Bergerac ever enjoyed. It is true that Perelman would take the company private in the spring of 1987, so Drapkin would not take his king's ransom out of public shareholders' money. But his employment agreement went into effect when Revlon Group was still a public company, and after taking the company private in the spring of '87, Perelman would owe public bondholders roughly $3.70 billion. The debt-to-equity ratio of McAndrews and Forbes, at the top of the Perelman pyramid, would be 18-1. In his 6-year employment agreement with McAndrews and Forbes Holdings, which comes just under Perelman in the corporate chart of the Perelman empire, with all the other companies under it, Drapkin would receive $2 million as an inducement to enter into this employment agreement, which guaranteed him a salary that would escalate from $2,500,000 in 1987 to $4,192,650 by 1992. In addition, he would receive a bonus of $1 million each year. He would further be entitled to 20% of net trading professor ITS in investment partnerships that would be formed. A separate 5-year employment agreement with Revlon would guarantee Drapkin $1,150,000 each year. Thus Drapkin was to start his employment at Revlon, this paradigm of the new cost-cutting corporate age, with a guaranteed take by March 1988 of $6.70 million, which with Perelman-type trading professor ITS factored in could easily range into the tens of millions. Nor would Drapkin be the sole beneficiary of such Professor Legacy. Bruce Slavin and Howard Gittes would also be guaranteed many millions. When this reporter came to interview him, Perelman assumed his interview posture. He was wearing his uniform navy cardigan sweater. He sank low into his chair, removed his tasseled Gucci loafers, put his navy-stockinged feet up on the coffee table, and worked his cigar. The posture was casual but the man was not. He continually ground his molars. He seemed to be straining to project a pleasant image, but what kept appearing from underneath, pentimento-like, was a mix of impatience, vulgarity and boiling temper that was anything but pleasant. He raged at his secretary for taking 6 steps toward him to hand him a piece of paper after he had ordered her to summon Drapkin, something which required her to walk in the opposite direction. Associates say that he yells constantly at everyone who works with him: Jitis, Slavin, Drapkin, Drexel investment bankers. No one except for Milken, they say, is exempt. One associate remarked, "It really is pretty bad. The excuse is he can't control it." When Drapkin arrived, Perelman addressed his erstwhile Revlon opponent's perception that by the end he was unstoppable, that if they had raised the bid to $59 he would have gone to $60. "There was no point where we were committed emotionally beyond financial reason," he declared. "Look at our record, in Richardson, for example. We have stopped where it made no sense to go forward." What about the fact that he had by that time raised $750 million, with high carrying charges? "It was reinvested," Perelman said shortly. "Right now I'm sitting on a cash hoard of $1.50 billion. I have a negative carry of about 1 point. I am willing to do that because tomorrow morning, without making a phone call, I could do 80% of the transactions that are available." Asked when he conceived of the megaleap he made with Revlon, Perelman replied that it was a process of bytes. No, he did not have this trajectory in mind when he started out in 1978 to buy the jewelry company, Cohen Haddif Ild. Go back to 1978. "Even if we net it, we couldn't have funded it," said Perelman, who refers to himself in the Rst person plural. This could not have been done without Drexel. As to the changes he has made thus far, Perelman said he had hired Richard Avedon to photograph high-fashion models for a new ad campaign and had cut through the excessive bureaucracy that plagued the company, eliminating numerous levels of review. All the bureaucracy, he added, stemmed from Bergerac. He did not run this company. "It's easier to shoot little birds than to run a company," interpolated Drapkin, referring to Bergerac's yearly shooting holidays in Scotland. "He put in layers of form rather than substance," Perelman went on. "Books this high, gesturing above his head, from each division. 4 times a year, he'd budget and rebudget. He brought that practice from ITT. Janine used that effectively. But Bergerac pulled out the form without the substance." Several times during the interview, Perelman denied that he had offered Bergerac extra inducements, either at the Rst meeting or later through Janine, the $100 million package, which was conference IRMED by one of Perelman's associates. Returning to this sore point, he put his shoes back on and paced the room, raising his voice. He demanded to know how Bergerac's charges, and his rebuttal, would be presented. "How can you believe what he says?" he demanded. "This guy was stuffing his pockets at every possible moment through the process. He had his finger in this pie from the very beginning. He was a guy totally motivated by greed. Do you think if I had said to him, 'Michel, what would it take?' he would have said, 'No, nothing'? Believe me, for $100 million, he would have taken it so fast your head would spin. He was stuffing his pockets at every opportunity. How can you believe this was not a guy who was stuffing his pockets? And what about that chateau bill in Scotland, prepaid for 2 years?" Perelman claims that before Bergerac left Revlon he wrote a company check to cover his shooting trips to Scotland. Perelman says he stopped payment on the check. And what about the 727 with the shower and the gun rack? Maybe you can say he didn't care about money because he was never spending his own. And what about when he took the china and silverware? He said he'd bought it, and then I came in here, Perelman argued, and they were rolling up the rug in his ICE and taking the wallpaper off the walls. Yes, the wallpaper. There was this $25,000 mural, African wildlife, and they were taking it off the wall. I said, wait a minute. If this stuff is his and he wants to take anything else out of here, I want to see invoices. That mural, Perelman said in disgust, was the ugliest thing I've ever seen. It's rolled up in the basement. He xed his visitor with a baleful look. Does that sound like a guy who is bashful about taking? The Revlon saga has no heroes. Bergerac, though far from being the inept villain that Perelman caricatures, indulged himself with the perks of corporate life. Perelman, cursed with his crude persona that offends so many, apparently attempted to entice Bergerac with lavish inducements and then furiously denied it. And Revlon's defenders, the cream of the legal and investment banking establishment, allowed their professional judgment to be clouded by their passion and their prejudice. On Milken's chessboard, however, all that mattered was that his pawns keep moving deeper into corporate America, decimating its ranks further, making bids and acquisitions and issuing junk bonds and doing streams of divestitures and making new acquisitions, until one day the game would be won. Part 3. The Zenith and the Fall 10. Drexel is like a god. BY November 1986, Milken was scouting new frontiers. "We want to finance the world with our goodies," proclaimed Drexel chairman Robert Linton. Indeed, Milken hoped to replicate in other parts of the world the hostile contest for control that his chosen had waged so successfully in this country. Japan, where the hostile takeover was still nascent, was his FI-RST target. On November 10, Drexel held a mini Predators ball in Tokyo. Milken presided over this lavish affair. It featured 2 days of presentations, with simultaneous translation, by a familiar cast, a dozen of Drexel's star junk issuers, including Revlon Group, Wix Companies, Occidental Petroleum Corporation, MCI Communications, Texas Air Corporation and Triangle Industries. The U.S. ambassador to Japan, Mike Mansef ILD, was a luncheon speaker. The event was organized by Harry Horowitz, Milken's Washington lobbyist and the chief organizer of the Beverly Hills Bond Conference in 1985. Even Don Engel, of Bungalow 8 fame, was on hand to play his accustomed part, ushering some of the Drexel clients to baths, Japanese massage parlors, outside Tokyo each night after dinner. Drexel executives deemed the conference a huge success. They believed that the Japanese, while still cautious, they traditionally were buyers of AAA credits with household names, were now ready to wade into the junk market. The Japanese seemed receptive to the gospel Milken preached. That the rating agencies were wrong and that they, the Japanese investors, should reap the benefit of those prevailing misconceptions, as so many thousands of their American counterparts had done over the past decade, by investing in the high-yield companies of the future. While Milken did not make it explicit to this audience, they were participating in the FI-RST phase of the process he had authored in the United States. First he would build a client base of buyers. Then he would raise capital for small-time entrepreneurs. And finally he would transform those entrepreneurs into mighty challengers, financing their raids on the giants of Japanese industry. The process would be replicated, but the time would be compressed. What had taken 7 or 8 years to evolve in the US would probably occur within 2. And even if the Japanese culture proved too inimical to the hostile takeover in Japan, Milken still wanted to tap the reservoir of Japanese capital to mount raids in this country that were far larger than any he had ever backed, 10 and 15 and $20 billion bids. It seemed only natural by the fall of 1986 that Milken should be expanding his scope to cover the world. The home territory, where he was using junk bonds to revolutionize and restructure the American corporate landscape, was in some sense already appropriated. While there were certainly many more battles to be fought, many more giant corporations to be won, Milken's gospel had gained such currency that it was no longer the heresy of an outcast but the liturgy of Wall Street. If everyone had decided to come to his FI-RST party, mustn't it be time to start another? Milken may have been restless, but many of his colleagues would have been content to pause and savor the moment. That Milken, and Drexel with him, could have scaled the heights they had made some of them lightheaded. Who would have imagined that such a rarefied atmosphere would ever be theirs to enjoy? The payout from Milken's singular idea had been so bountiful, in terms of money and power, and even a growing social acceptance, that the prevailing mood at Drexel in the fall of 1986 was close to euphoria. It was captured in a framed quote, in large, bold print, which Drexel investment banker Stephen Weinroth had displayed in his office. Referring to the junk bond market and takeovers, it read, "Drexel is like a god in that end of the business, and a god can do anything it wants. They are awesome. You hate to do business against them." The quote was from Michael Boylan, the president of McFadden Holdings, excerpted from an article in the June 1986 issue of Barron's. It had been sent to Weinroth and other colleagues by Arthur Bilger, of Drexel's Beverly Hills corporate finance department. Many of Drexel's wish lists drawn up in early Cava's go-by sessions, wish lists which had been wistful, grandiose, almost delusional at the time, had become reality. Among them was the goal articulated by Leon Black in 1979 when he recorded the corporate finance team's resolution to FIND and helped create the robber barons of the future. Now, in 1986, Black expounded happily on his fully realized goal. "What I like about Drexel is that our clients are the growth companies of this country, and the heads of these companies are often real principals. They are the modern version of robber barons," Black declared expansively. "These are the guys shaking up management. These are the guys who are building empires." He ticked off his favorites, his friend and client Carl Icahn, Henry Kravis of Kohlberg Kravis, with whom he had worked on that FIRM $6.20 billion buyout of the Beatrice companies, Samuel Heyman, the chairman of GAF, whose $6 billion bid for Union Carbide had been financed by Drexel, Rupert Murdoch, whose purchase of television stations from Metro Media had been financed by Drexel, and Ronald Perelman. "I look at them as the Rockefellers of 100 years ago," Black continued eagerly. "They're very, very bright. They keep you awake. They've got lots of guts." But Black reserved his most exuberant praise for the man who made all this possible. "I'm not much given to hero worship, but I have to tell you I never thought there would be a Michael Milken. He's someone who sees the big picture all the time, and also the small picture, down to the details. He knows so many industries in such depth. He knows the balance sheets of companies better than many of our clients do. And he is so aggressive. He has an absolutely voracious appetite. He wants 100% market share. To be creating empire builders, choosing them, molding them, sitting on their boards, owning pieces of their growing companies, was heady business, especially for investment bankers who, before 1985, had been the lesser knowns of Wall Street. Black was not alone in his breathlessness. One of his colleagues in corporate finance, G. Christian Anderson, who had lived through what he refers to as the baton death march on Wall Street in the early 70s, when he bounced from one failing firm to another, declared that he once had thought of getting his doctorate and teaching history. But now, in 1986, he said he felt he was making history. "We are the gentlemen who finance and create change," Anderson declared. When I read Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, and he described this vortex of change that whirls around us, and it happens very fast in New York City, and slower in Des Moines, and even slower in the outback of Australia, the thing that was amazing to me was, when I looked at the funnel of that maelstrom, the vortex of that sits right in the middle of my desk. I am the fella who determines what the change will be. If I don't finance it, it ain't gonna happen. I get to decide who's going to get capital, to make the future. Now, I ask you, what's more romantic than that? As overblown as Anderson's image of himself had become, there was a germ of truth in what he said. For the most highly leveraged mega acquisitions, the nouveau entrepreneurs who were changing the face of corporate America, Drexel was indeed the only conduit. What Drexel had done was to securitize the low-grade corporate loan, much as Salomon Brothers had securitized mortgages in its creation of the mortgage-backed security. In its securitizing of the corporate loan, Drexel had to some degree displaced the banks and the insurance companies, which had formerly had the acquisition financing rolled to themselves, just as their clients, America's major corporations, had had the acquisitor roll to themselves. Now those banks' clients were as likely to be prey as predator. And those clients were being felled, one after another, in acquisitions more highly leveraged than the banks would ever have financed. The banks were lenders in many of Drexel's deals, but their loans were generally short-term and secured. Without Drexel to place the unsecured, subordinated debt, these deals would never have happened. And while other investment banking firms now were eager to play Drexel's part, the megadeals spawned securities, junk bonds, in amounts that no investment banking firm but Drexel could sell. Drexel's monopoly of this market, following the earlier years of monopoly of the non-takeover junk market, had resulted in a trajectory of growth that was unprecedented on Wall Street. At the end of 1977, Drexel's revenues were about $150 million. The firm had about $75 million in capital, of which less than $40 million was equity. The book value of its stock, as of August 1977, was $4.47 per share. By the end of 1985, the firm's revenues were $2.50 billion. It had about $1 billion of capital, of which over 75% was equity. The book value of its stock was $58.66 per share. Its professor ITS were thought to be about $600 million pre-tax and $304.20 million after taxes, which would place it not far behind the mammoth Salomon Brothers, which had nearly doubled Drexel's capital. And by the end of 1986, Drexel's revenues would soar to a record $4 billion and its after-tax earnings to an estimated $545.50 million, making it the most professor-I-table investment banking firm in America. Salomon was second in earnings, with $516 million. Goldman Sachs is a closely held partnership which, like Drexel, does not publicly report earnings, but its earnings were estimated by Perrin Long, an analyst at Lipper Analytical Services, Inc., to have been between $475 million and $500 million. The engine of this growth, of course, was Milken's Group. In 1978 it had been contributing 100% of the firm's professor ITS. With the growth of corporate finance, which Milken fueled, FIRST with the original issuance of junk bonds and then with the LBOs and the takeovers, the share of Milken's Group in the firm's professor ITS declined to roughly 43% by the end of 1985. But corporate finance, his adjunct, had been increasing its professor ITS at a rate of roughly 50% a year. In 1977 the corporate finance department had $4.20 million in revenues. In 1985, it had made about $700 million. In this entrepreneurial firm, where salaries were moderate and all the heavy compensation came in bonuses, those payouts were staggering. In 1985 Drexel is said to have devoted roughly $400 minus $500 million of its $2.50 billion in revenues to bonuses. Milken, Drexel's highest paid member, is said to have received about $40 million as his bonus. This did not include, of course, Professor ITS from all his trading partnerships and other investments, which associates estimated brought him closer to $100 million for the year. And even the top bankers in corporate finance, who had always felt like the poor cousins compared to Milken and his group, had little to complain about. Leon Black, for example, is said by one friend to have received about $8 million in a bonus payment that included warrants. And in 1986 Drexel would pay out as much as $600 million in bonuses, with Milken and his high-yield department reportedly receiving over $250 million and corporate finance receiving $140 million. One corporate finance executive, who estimated by the fall of 1986 that his bonus for that year would be roughly $9 million, commented, "This is Disneyland for adults." As spectacular as Drexel's Professor ITS were, they were no anomaly on Wall Street in the early and middle 80s. The M&A frenzy had thrown off enormous fees to the other major investment banking firms even before Drexel had a toehold in the business. Also, the period from 1981 to 1986 had seen one of the most powerful, sustained surges in stock and bond history. Firms were awash in trading Professor ITS. A number of Wall Street investment houses had taken advantage of this prosperity, too, to sell shares to the public and transform themselves from private partnerships into giant worldwide corporations. Salomon Brothers, which merged with the publicly owned Fibro Corporation in 1981, had increased its capital from only $200 million in 1980 to about $3 billion by mid-1986. But no other investment banking firm had vaulted into the financial stratosphere at Drexel's velocity. And no other firm had redefined the M&A business on its own unique terms, with the ability to raise billions of dollars almost overnight, from Milken's junk bond network, terms which could not be matched by anyone else on the street. Other firms sought to imitate Drexel. They attempted to break into the junk bond market. They embarked on merchant banking. They initiated bridge financing, at great risk to themselves, in a desperate attempt to compete with the highly conference-ident weapon. What had happened by the fall of 1986, quite simply, was that Milken had cast not only Drexel but to a large degree the street in his image. The most powerful firms, with the most cachet, had made their entrances into the heretofore disdained junk market in 1983 and 1984. By the end of 1985, Salomon, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and First Boston, in that order, were each making small incursions into Milken's preserve. Trailing close behind them came many other notable investment banks. Drexel's market share slipped to about 56% from the sovereign 60 to 70% it had held in earlier years. But even now, with its market share lowered, there was no close second, just a crowd of would-be competitors at the lower end of the chart. In 1985 Drexel had done 73 deals, for a total of $6.70 billion, and Salomon, its closest competitor, had done 9 deals for $1.40 billion. Some of Milken's colleagues at Drexel took undisguised pleasure in their rivals' flounderings. Morgan Stanley, for example, having FIRST suffered the Oxoco debacle, where the company had defaulted within 6 months of the underwriting, had embarrassed itself further in its underwriting of $540 million of People Express bonds, some of which had plunged to as little as 35% of their issue price by July 1986. As Chris Anderson commented to the Wall Street Journal, they, Morgan Stanley, announced with great fanfare that they were coming in to gentrify the high-yield market. Anderson was referring to a trade publication headline that had trumpeted Morgan's entrance. I wonder how they feel about it today. Maybe it's a tough business. Maybe it isn't any more genteel than the steel business or the auto business or the banking business. Milken struck a different note. He told this reporter in an interview in 1987, "I welcome competition. Other people might see things we don't see. We might see things they don't see. The negatives are, and I'm trying to state this in a positive way, that some deals may get done that shouldn't get done, and then that may hurt the perception of the high-yield market. People have a tendency to remember only the ones that didn't work out." Financing is an art form, Milken added. One of the challenges is how to correctly finance a company. In certain periods of time, more covenants need to be put into deals. You have to be sure the company has the right covenant, to allow it the freedom to grow, but also to ensure the integrity of the credit. Sometimes a company should issue convertible bonds instead of straight bonds. Sometimes it should issue preferred stock. Each company and each financing is different, and the process can't be imitative. By 1986, Milken's rivals had also followed in his footsteps by venturing into merchant banking, a term borrowed from the British, whose investment banks in the 19th century had pooled capital to buy businesses and thus had built empires. In this country it meant that the FIRMs were putting up their own capital in deals, mainly takeovers and buyouts. They were no longer acting solely as agent, but also as principal. This was something, of course, that Drexel, through Milken, as well as a few others, such as Allen and Company, had been doing for years. But Drexel's rivals had also come up with a new variation on merchant banking, the bridge loan. There, the investment bank puts up its own capital as a loan in order to facilitate a client's deal. That loan in effect bridges the time from the closing of the deal to the time when the junk bonds are sold. The proceeds of the sale then pay off the loan or, if the investment bank is leaving some of its capital in the deal, part of it. In their enthusiasm, Solomon and a group of institutional lenders who were participating in thus funding deals together dubbed themselves the Bridge Club. It was inevitable, once these FIRMs, tantalized by those 3 to 4% spreads, had followed Milken into the original issuance of junk bonds, that they would then attempt to follow him the next step, to the junk bond financed takeover and buyout. How could they not try, after watching Drexel garner a financing fee of $86 million in the Beatrice buyout? Milken had no patent on greed. Although he did, arguably, give the word new meaning. Drexel's financing fee in Beatrice was dwarfed by the amount Drexel partners were said to have earned by 1987 from their equity stakes in the deal. Close to $800 million, several hundred million of which was said to have gone to Milken personally. But none of these investment banks had Milken's ability to tap into his network and raise billions overnight. None of them could enlist his buyers to give them a bridge loan, which is in essence what these buyers did for Milken. His first-tier buyers, who committed to buy the bonds and earned the commitment fees, but were often replaced by second-tier buyers by the time the deal was funded, or shortly thereafter, provided him a bridge. Milken's rivals had two problems. First, they didn't have Milken's distribution system, and so they were unable to place $4-5 billion in junk. Second, they needed more time to place what they could. The bridge loan cured the time problem and made deals with less than $2 billion in junk financing viable for them. From the client's standpoint, the bridge went the highly conference ident letter one better. While that letter had been largely accepted in the business world as transmutable into cold cash, it was not cold cash. But now First Boston, Morgan Stanley, Shearson Lehman, Merrill Lynch, Solomon Brothers and others were offering to put cash into their clients' hands, and take the risk of the refinancing themselves. That risk was considerable, for time here was a two-edged sword. Crucial for them to be able to place the bonds, but dangerous in that the market could change. That, of course, had been the beauty of Milken's system. That there was such bountiful reward for so little risk to him or the firm. When Icahn suggested that Drexel in essence give him a bridge loan in Phillips, his proposal had been dismissed and the highly conference ident letter conceived instead. But in their desperation to reap Drexel-like rewards, other firms were seduced into greater risk than Drexel had ever taken. These firms' deepest obeisance to Drexel, however, came not when they tried to imitate and compete, but when they simply gave up and encouraged their clients to bring this much-hated rival into their deals, so that the dreadnought would be on their side. According to two executives at Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette, which along with Drexel represented management in the buyout of Viacom, they had urged their clients to hire Drexel, for just that reason. And it was the same thinking, according to a well-placed source, that led Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, in planning a defensive restructuring after a month of frenzied trading in its stock during October 1986, to hire Drexel along with its traditional investment banking firm, Goldman Sachs. While the rest of Wall Street was trying occasionally to disarm but more often to compete with the renegade firm, Drexel was not only fighting to keep its lion's share, but also gearing for posterity. Fred Joseph had become the firm's chief executive off ICER in May 1985. And Joseph was intent on building a towering, enduring financial institution from the foundation that Milken's machine had laid. Over the past several years, Drexel had been plowing some of its enormous professor ITS into new areas. Dr. Richard Sandor, generally considered the principal architect of the interest rate futures markets, joined Drexel in 1982 to develop a financial futures division. Joseph's brother, Stephen Joseph, joined Drexel from Solomon Brothers in 1984 to start a mortgage-backed securities department. By 1986, his department had 280 employees and ranked in the top 5A of the industry. In municipal finance, where it also expanded enormously through lateral hiring, Drexel in '86 underwrote some $15 billion in offerings, up from $1 billion 2 years earlier. It went from being ranked as the 40th largest participant to number 11 or number 12. And in '86 Drexel also moved from 15th to 8th place in U.S. government securities trading. And Drexel, albeit far more measuredly than some of its compatriots, such as Solomon, followed the Wall Street trend toward globalization, expanding its off-ICES abroad, particularly London and Tokyo. Symbolic of this drive to make itself into a well-rounded Wall Street titan was Drexel's decision, in July 1986, to move from its scattered quarters at 55 and 60 Broad Street into the brand-new 2 million square foot, 47-story tower, 7 World Trade Center. Drexel, which acquired a minority interest in the skyscraper, committed to lease the entire building for $100 million a year. In 1986 the firm had 4,300 employees in New York, but the new tower, it was planned, would eventually house 10,000 employees. This institution building was Joseph's vision more than Milken's. It always had been. What motivated Milken was a consuming passion for dollars, and for an empire, ever widening, to control. But Joseph was bent on fulfilling the ambition he had expressed to Mark Kaplan, Drexel's then president, 6 months after arriving at the firm in 1974, when he said that, given 15 years, he could create something as important as Goldman Sachs. The iconoclastic Milken would have derided such an aspiration. Joseph, however, did not wish to remain the outsider forever. He would join the club. And now, 12 years after his declaration to Kaplan, he was on track. As Stephen Weinroth remarked, "Don't take me literally, but Fred, Joseph, would like to travel around the country and say, Drexel is the largest underwriter of corporate securities, and of this, and of that. He'd like to say, the largest in all things. And if he had to say that we were second largest in trading of government securities of Somaliland, he'd say, but we're gaining on the leader. And if we were the largest in everything, and we made only $10 million, he'd still be happy. He's a market share guy. A central tenet at Drexel, frequently articulated by both Milken and Joseph, was that it was not capital but people that were the scarce resource. Both of them, therefore, were willing to pay more than anybody on the street in order to hire and keep those they considered the best. In Milken's group, where the pay had been astronomical since the 70s, there were few defections. It was a historic event when, in the fall of 1986, one of Milken's traders of more recent vintage, Eugene Wong, was hired away by Prudential Batch. The headhunter had made a host of calls, seeking one of Milken's disciples. People did burn out, or worse, under Milken's ceaseless lash. One trader was rumored to have been found under his desk chewing his phone cord one day. But then they were generally shifted to less stressful positions off the trading desk, or placed outside Drexel to operate as adjuncts. A few simply retired, at an early age. Charles Causey, who had been with Milken since the Drexel Firestone days, gave it all up in 1981 and moved to Islamorada in the Florida Keys, to devote himself to Bone Fi Shing. In 1985 and 86, Joseph had gone on a Phi RM-wide hiring binge, as part of his goal of diversifying the Phi RM strength and expertise. By early 1986, one big drawing card he was playing as a recruiter was that Goldman Sachs was the only other highly Professor I-table private firm on the street. If Drexel ever went public, its shareholders and the stock was widely held throughout. The firm, with about 1,800 stockholders in all, would be likely to reap a bonanza. Now, in the fall of 1986, Joseph pointed with pride to some of his star recruits. Martin Siegel, whom he had finally succeeded in wooing from Kidder, Sam Hunter and Michael Jack Kugler from Merrill Lynch, Jeffrey Beck from Oppenheimer and Company, and Robert Pangia from Kidder. He had had some rejections, among them Bruce Wasserstein, the M&A star at First Boston, who would later leave to start his own firm, and Michael Zimmerman, a fast-rising M&A banker at Salomon Brothers who would soon become co-head of M&A there. But Joseph was still ardently recruiting. The day Drexel gets the last of the best people, for each position, is the day the bottle's over, he promised. And the buckets of money that Drexel was offering were not only for the superstars. Offers to the lower-tiered people also made the pay at other firms seem, as Martin Siegel had once commented, like the margarine spread. The case of one analyst at Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette is typical. DLJ had hired him out of Harvard Business School at $80,000 a year. After he had been with them for 1 year, he was doing good though not exceptional work in the healthcare field, and his salary and bonuses had risen to about $110,000. Drexel, meanwhile, had hired a corporate finance team specializing in healthcare businesses from Kidder, but it lacked an analyst. So Drexel targeted the DLJ analyst. They offered him $350,000. According to a DLJ executive, the analyst had been happy at the firm, content with his salary, never even imagining that he could be making more than 3 times as much. But when that tripled offer came, it was too much to resist. It was clear by the fall of 1986, however, that in Drexel's sweep of the street, in its self-touting as the hottest firm, one with a daring-do, entrepreneurial culture where there was virtually no limit to the dollars that someone with talent and drive could make, it had attracted some so greedy that even Drexel was unable to sat their hunger. Dennis Levine was a warm, jovial investment banker whose personality outshone his intellectual attributes. Nonetheless, he had made himself into enough of an M&A presence that when he was passed over for a managing directorship at Shearson Lehman in 1984 and decided to leave, he received job offers from 3 other top investment banking firms. But it was Drexel, which guaranteed the 33-year-old an income of $1 million a year, that won the auction. On May 12, 1986, Levine was arrested, handcuffed and taken off to spend the night at the Metropolitan Correction Center. He was accused by the SEC of having made $12.60 million in illegal Professor ITS through insider trading in FTY4 stocks. And in June he pleaded guilty to 4 felony counts and agreed to cooperate with the government in its continuing investigation. Drexel reeled from the scandal. "It's more than embarrassing," Linton, the FIRM's chairman, told Businessweek. "It's like someone breaking into your home. You almost feel dirty about it." In private at the firm, it quickly became material for gallows humor. "Did you hear why Mike Phi read Dennis?" quipped one Drexel investment banker. "Because anybody who had to do Phi FTY4 trades to make $12 million couldn't be any good." Levine's case quickly mushroomed into the scandal of Wall Street as his cooperation with the government led to charges against members of his ring, investment bankers from Shearson Lehman, Lazard Frères and Goldman Sachs, and a lawyer from Wachtell, Lipton. Moreover, within the next several months there were 2 other indictments, unrelated to the Levine case, brought against Drexel employees. One was arbitrager Robert Salisbury, who was alleged to be a member of yet another insider trading ring. The other was senior vice president in the FIRM's expanding international finance department, Antonio Gebauer, who was charged with having misappropriated funds from client accounts while he was a banker at Morgan Guaranty Trust Company. Milken had hired Gebauer to work on his Third World Debt project, attempting to find some original approach to the crisis, which, if found, would probably rival the original issuance of junk bonds in its payout. Both these individuals ultimately pleaded guilty. Drexel officials pointed out that all 3, Levine, Salisbury and Gebauer, had been at Drexel for less than a year, and that their criminal conduct had started, and, in Gebauer's case, occurred wholly before they arrived at Drexel. Furthermore, Drexel was by no means alone in this spreading scandal. With Goldman Sachs, Lazard Frères, Morgan Guaranty, and Wachtell, Lipton, Drexel was arguably in better company than it had ever been. By the fall of '86, the shock of Levine, who had been by far the most high-profile of Drexel's miscreants, had faded at Drexel. Soon, Drexel officials hoped he would be forgotten, erased from public memory, as cleanly as he had been wiped from Drexel's annals. Copies of Drexel's glossy 1985 annual report had just been distributed in the firm when the news of Levine's arrest hit. They were quickly recalled. New copies were issued, and in place of Dennis Levine's smiling image Martin Siegel's appeared. Siegel moved from Kidder to Drexel in February 1986. In so doing, he was betting more on Joseph than on Milken. After about a half-dozen meetings with Joseph through the summer of 1985, he had gone out to the West Coast in October to meet Milken. Siegel had found Milken almost frightening. Like a speed junkie, he thought, incapable of sitting still, shooting off ideas, here and there, like a sparkler. Milken told him, "When you start to add up how much you have, I don't want you working for me. Then you're not hungry anymore." Siegel thought Milken wanted to be the richest man in the world. That kind of rawness was not something Siegel wished to see in himself. He felt more comfortable with Joseph, a bright, smooth-talking and attractive salesman, like himself, and with Joseph's projection of their building a world-class financial institution together. He and Joseph were both builders, Siegel decided. He had built Kidder's M&A department from nothing, and Joseph, powered by Milken's engine, might indeed create an institution comparable to a Morgan Stanley, a First Boston, a Goldman Sachs. Siegel thought it was a historic opportunity to be in the vanguard of such an enterprise. And he and Joseph agreed that his presence would accelerate that process. Siegel had a franchise in tender offer defense, a whole roster of blue-chip and loyal clients, who, he guessed, would follow him anywhere, even into Drexel's lion's den. He made sure, too, that his relationship with Martin Lipton, with whom he had worked on so many deals and who was also a kind of father figure to him, would remain intact. That relationship had been soldered in 1983 when together they had inaugurated the poison pill, Lipton's creation, defending Lennox, Inc., against an attempted takeover by Brown-Forman Distillers Corporation. Other investment bankers on whom Lipton had tried to foist his poison pill had been reluctant to use it. It was sure to be open to legal challenge, they argued, and if successful it might kill the golden goose, the takeover business. But Lipton had urged Siegel that they should implement it, that if they did they would own the defense market. And that is not far from what had happened. Lipton had proceeded to carve out his defense franchise, refusing to represent aggressors in hostile junk bond financed deals and, of course, becoming one of the fiercest, most outspoken critics of what he derisively called Drexel's hostile, junk bond, two-tiered, bust-up takeover. Now Lipton promised Siegel that despite Siegel's joining the Huns, he would continue to work with him, but only on defense. So Drexel got not only Martin Siegel, but the promise of a sometime alliance with the dean of the defense bar in M&A, and the erstwhile leader of the establishment onslaught against Drexel into the bargain. Lipton negotiated Siegel's employment contract with Drexel. That contract assured that at the same time that Siegel would be satisfying his image of himself as a builder, he would be getting richer. He had obtained from Drexel a guarantee of $3 million a year for 3 years. With possible further bonuses and his investments in Milken's trading partnerships, he was sure to make much more. Drexel had also promised to make him whole on the Professor IT he would have reaped on his Kidder stock. He was that FIRM's fourth largest shareholder. If Kidder went public or was sold within 2 years of his coming to Drexel. Kidder was bought by General Electric about 6 months after Siegel left. If Siegel needed further confirmation of the financial opportunism of his move, he got it when the results of the first 2 months of 1986 came in at Drexel. In each of those months, Drexel made more money than Kidder had in the entire preceding year. However leery of Milken, Siegel had been at their initial meeting. Once he joined Drexel, he too came under Milken's spell. He went out to Beverly Hills for 3-day periods, spending from 4 a.m. to 8 p.m. with the indefatigable Milken, and was awed by the fecundity of ideas that had first seemed to him wild and uncontrolled. At Kidder, he had had to generate the new ideas, and they had never come to him from the trading side. Now Milken was the generator. Siegel's primary mission, however, as conceptualized by him and Joseph, was to build a defense business at Drexel, with the kinds of blue-chip clients the firm had never had. If Drexel was to become a major financial institution, it could no longer be merely a haven for renegades. Siegel's goal was to have 20 FIVA or 30 clients on a tender defense retainer, much as the law firm of Skadden, Arps did. And he got off to a good start. In his first month at Drexel, he contacted about 20 of his old clients. He began to represent several, either on defense or on financing. One was Lear Siegler, the aerospace concern and manufacturer of auto parts, which needed help because its stock was being accumulated by the green-mailing Belzberg brothers. Siegel was, of course, well situated to mediate with the Belzbergs, They had been part of Milken's coterie ever since Mesa Gulf. And ultimately the Beltzbergs were bought out by Lear Siegler. According to Dan Dorfman in New York Magazine, the Beltzbergs made a professor IT of almost $7.50 million. But the potential conference licts that could arise in Drexel's attempting to go both ways were vividly illustrated at this time. Contemporaneous with Drexel's representing Lear Siegler against the dreaded Beltzbergs, it was also representing the Beltzbergs as they green-mailed Ashland Oil. Here the Beltzbergs reaped a professor IT of $15.40 million, according to Dorfman. If there was not an ethical dilemma, conference licts of interest are rarely recognized in the investment banking world. Such dual purpose might give pause to the sort of client Siegel was trying to bring aboard. Potential clients might wonder, as they disclosed their financials to their investment banker, where his loyalty, or that of his partners, really resided. Siegel decided that the best way for his Kidder clients to overcome their fear of Drexel would be for them to become acquainted with his partners, to meet Milken, to understand that true security lay in their being in the Drexel camp, not outside it. So he invited more than a dozen of them to the 1986 Predators Ball. In 1 year so much had changed that even the old name, Predators Ball, sounded faintly archaic. Among the 2,000 guests were many CEOs of major corporations. T. Boone Pickens, the raider who had started it all with Mesa Gulf, and had been a keynote speaker at Drexel conferences in 1984 and 1985, attended but was not invited to speak, and was clearly miffed. Ronald Perelman, now chairman of Revlon, opened the conference, and Dr. Armand Hammer, chairman of Occidental, closed it. There were also presentations by Beatrice, Gulf Plus Western, Burroughs, Warner Communications and Lear Siegler. As one of the conference organizers exclaimed excitedly, "It's the Academy Awards of business." The old ethos was still there, though not as strident and all-encompassing as in years past. In one of the videos that are produced each year at Milken's direction, Dallas Jr. Ewing, Larry Hagman, appeared, flashing a Drexel Express titanium card, which, he declared, had a $10 billion line of credit. Jr. urged, "Don't go hunting without it." But the best line of the conference, most participants agreed, was delivered by Nelson Peltz, who was asked to give a presentation for the Phi RST time. A year earlier, Peltz had been a nervous hopeful, with nothing to his name but a controlling interest in a meager wire and cable company. Now he was magically transformed into one of the nation's industrialists, with a controlling interest in a $4 billion empire. In a play on Winston Churchill's famous declaration, Peltz gazed out at the crowd, many of them holders of his bonds, and declared, "Never have so few owed so much to so many." Martin Siegel played a prominent role, appearing on a panel and at one point, in reference to his move from the Bluenose Kidder to the dread Drexel, donned Phi RST a white cowboy hat and then a black. His old Kidder clients, among them the chairman of Lear Siegler and Pan American, seemed rather dazzled by it all. One guest wondered, "Wow, Marty, does Kidder throw these kinds of things?" But probably no one was more dazzled than Siegel himself. The personal wealth there, he calculated, was 3 times the GNP. And it was not only the sheer dollars but the power and influence that he found so awe-inspiring. One manifestation of that growing power and influence was a political presence far larger than at any previous conference. Senators Bill Bradley and Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey, Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio and Alan Cranston of California all spoke at the conference. Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole was supposed to appear as a surprise speaker at a corporate finance breakfast, but he canceled at the last moment. Representative Timothy Worth of Colorado and Massachusetts Senator Edward M. Kennedy came, but they were not speakers. Kennedy told me, recalled Tubby Burnham, "I'm here to listen and to learn." Drexel had spared no effort, and no expense, in educating Congress over the past year and a half. Representative Worth was one of the early recipients of Drexel's lavish attentions, not surprisingly, since he chaired the hearings of the House Subcommittee on Telecommunications, Consumer Protection and Finance on Takeovers, in 1984 and again in the FI-RST half of 1985. At FI-RST, Worth spearheaded the congressional assault, but by April 1985, when he attended the Predators Ball, he was straddling the fence, and by the end of that year he had become a staunch supporter of Drexel and its junk bonds. In fact, one of his top aides, David Aylward, left his job with Worth to help organize Alliance for Capital Access, a lobby formed to oppose federal limits on junk bond financings, formed by Drexel clients at Drexel's prompting. The leader of Alliance was Larry Meisel of MDC Holdings, a longtime issuer of junk bonds and also a major subscriber to the bonds in the takeover deals. Under the Federal Election Campaign Act, the limits on contributions to candidates per election are $1,000 for a contribution by an individual and $5,000 by a multi-candidate committee, the category in which Drexel's Political Action Committee falls. In 1985, Drexel's PAC donated $2,000 to Worth, falling short of its limit by $3,000. But contributions by individuals at the FI-IRM, including $1,000 from both Michael and Lowell Milken, and $1,000 from Gary Winnick, who left the FI-IRM in the fall of '85, totaled about $17,000. Roughly $9,000 of this was comprised of donations of $250 from members of the Milken Group. There were also some contributions from Milken's extended family. Donations from Tom Spiegel, Abraham Spiegel, Helena Spiegel, Adita Spiegel, Lee Eckel, a Columbia Savings Director, and a Columbia PAC totaled $7,150. While Drexel executives knew that Worth was their supporter by the latter half of 1985, Wachtell, Lipton, with Martin Lipton spearheading the anti-junk crusade, apparently did not. In late 1985, 20 members of the Wachtell FI-IRM each donated $500 to Worth, for a total of $10,000. By mid-1985, the center of activity for anti-takeover legislation had shifted from the House to the Senate, and Senator Alphonse M. D'Amato of New York, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee's Subcommittee on Securities, had primacy. Drexel was by far the biggest donor among FI-National FI-RMS to D'Amato from 1981 to 1986. Its contributions totaled $70,750. The next highest D'Amato contribution from an investment banking FI-IRM was Morgan Stanley's at $40,600. As reported by Bruce Ingersoll and Brooks Jackson in the Wall Street Journal, Drexel's courting of D'Amato moved into high gear at the end of May 1985, when D'Amato was preparing to hold hearings on proposed legislation. One bill would have curbed the use of junk bonds in takeovers and buyouts, and another would have limited junk bond purchases by thrifts. Harry Horowitz, Milken's boyhood chum who joined Milken's group in 1979 to perform administrative functions and by the mid-'80s was his Washington lobbyist and Predators Ball organizer, set up a fundraising dinner for D'Amato at Chasen's in Beverly Hills. The guest list at that dinner included 23 executives from Drexel and a half dozen from Columbia Savings and Loan, including Thomas Spiegel. D'Amato's take from this dinner was more than $33,000. During the late spring of 1985, the wave of anti-takeover sentiment in Congress was cresting, and many legislators were eager to take some action. According to the Journal account, D'Amato assured his fellow senators that he would have legislation ready to be considered before the summer recess. That, however, did not happen. It was December 1985 when D'Amato finally had his draft bill readied, and by that time the issue had lost its heat. In any event, D'Amato's proposed legislation carried no provisions onerous to Drexel. On the subject of junk bonds, he suggested a federal study. 5 days after D'Amato introduced his innocuous bill, Fred Joseph and 35 other Drexel executives each donated $500 to the senator's campaign. In the end, of the 30 bills that dealt with regulating takeovers in 1984 and 1985, not one passed. While Drexel's, and other investment banking firms too, lobbying efforts were Herculean, at least as much credit for their non-passage must go to the Reagan administration, which had said that it would veto any such legislation. And the SEC, which was of course the agency most involved, did not support any of the proposed bills. This was hardly surprising, considering that it was the pro-takeover attitude of the SEC and the Justice Department, in its antitrust policies, under Reagan that had fueled the M&A activity of the early 80s. The SEC did do a study of junk bonds in takeover financing, which reached the predictable conclusion. Released in June 1986, it stated that there was no justification for new regulatory initiatives aimed at curbing the use of this kind of debt issuance in takeover bids or indeed as it relates to any other aspects of corporate financing activity. In their 1985 annual report, the President's Council of Economic Advisers had weighed in with its conclusions, surprising only in their ambitiousness. They purported to settle once and for all the decades-long debate over whether takeovers are beneficial or harmful. This August council concluded that mergers and acquisitions improve efficiency, transfer scarce resources to higher-valued uses, and stimulate effective corporate management. The conclusion was remarkably definitive but, apparently, more polemical than proven. In some of the more interesting testimony that emerged from the congressional hearings on takeovers, F.M. Shearer, a Swarthmore College economics professor, had rebutted the council's findings. In his testimony in March 1985, he pointed out that the report's conclusion that takeovers improve efficiency relied on stock market event studies, which are short-run in orientation, examining stock prices during periods 10 to 30 days before and after the announcement or consummation of the merger. If one looks at a period of 10 years or so, Professor Shearer testified, the results are very different. Shearer has developed the premier database in this country for looking at the financial consequences of merger. This database draws upon 27 years of merger history and 7 years of sell-off history for nearly 4,000 individual businesses. These are some of Shearer's findings, from his case studies and statistical research. Contrary to the council's view that merger makers sought companies where management had failed, most in fact targeted well-managed entities, such as National Can. What they were generally attracted by was not sick companies or slipshod management but undervalued assets. Takeovers by firms with no managerial expertise in the acquired company's line of business tended to impair, not improve, efficiency. Takeovers frequently led to short-run Professor IT maximizing strategies, such as the cash cow strategy under which a business is starved of R&D, equipment modernization, and advertising funds, and/or prices are set at high levels inviting competitor inroads, leaving in the end a depleted, non-competitive shell. On average, acquisitions were less professor-able for the acquiring firms than the maintenance of existing businesses and the internal development of new business lines. Many takeovers led to sell-offs, which did improve the efficiency of the simpler, self-standing entity. While Shearer had relatively few hostile takeovers in his sampling, In those he did study, he found that the takeover aggravated performance deficiencies that existed earlier. In response to questions from panel members, Shearer also made an interesting point about the high leverage, or debt-intensive, capital structures of many U.S. companies, which are coming to resemble Japanese companies' financial structures. Indeed, in the Gospel according to Milken, which is spread by so many of his acolytes, it is often noted that Japanese companies have for years carried much higher debt-to-equity ratios than American companies. True enough, Shearer commented, but the Japanese are able to carry such high levels of debt because when they get into financial difficulties the government bails them out. Shearer's testimony was followed by that of Warren Law, a professor at Harvard Business School. Law too had come to rebut the glittering generalities of the Council's report. The Council's reliance upon short-run stock market behavior as evidence that takeovers are beneficial, he said, could be accepted only if the stock market were a good judge of intrinsic values. As Milken and his entire coterie of raiders, who had made billions by identifying assets undervalued by the market, could have told this group, it is not. Law added that he did not believe that it could be strictly proven that takeovers deter or promote growth and productivity. Inasmuch as we cannot run history twice with and without them, we can only speculate. With this caveat, however, his speculation is that takeovers decrease productivity. He bases this view on a number of factors. Through takeovers, bigger FI-RMS are created, and he believes that large FI-RMS make fewer but bigger errors, tend to continue wrong policies too long, and have the resources to delay until crisis is unmistakable. Furthermore, he pointed out that in the late 1970s approximately half of all corporate acquisitions were also corporate divestitures, many of them businesses which were acquired during the last merger heyday of the 1960s. That wave, he said, was accompanied by an increasing tendency of executive suites to be dominated by people with financial and legal skills, executives who believed a manager with no special expertise in any particular industry could nevertheless step into an unfamiliar company and run it successfully through strict application of financial controls. The present dismantling of many conglomerates is the result of this folly. There is no reason to believe the result will differ this time. The takeover debate would be laid to rest neither by the 1985 annual report of the President's Council of Economic Advisers nor by Professor Shearer's research. While Shearer's conclusions appeared to be much more soundly based, one reason the debate has been so long-lived is that there is some truth on both sides. Some takeovers do result in more efficient and professor-I-table companies, even when the new manager-owner has no expertise in the industry and has been, as Frank Considine put it, a financial operator, but not an operator, as in the case, thus far, of Carl Icahn and TWA. Some, on the other hand, do result in companies so debt-laden that their R&D budgets are starved and they become non-competitive, as could conceivably become the case with Uniroyal Chemical, which was the professor-I-table, healthy core of the old Uniroyal and in its brief tenure under Nelson Peltz's aegis earned barely enough to cover the interest charges on its mountain of $1.06 billion debt. The questions that remain, of course, which of these scenarios occurs more often, and whether there is indeed a preponderance sufficiently quantifiable and large that one can conclude that most takeovers are beneficial or harmful, will not be able to be meaningfully addressed for the most recent wave of buyouts and takeovers for years. Despite the reservations that both Shearer and Law voiced about takeovers during their testimony before Congress, neither professor was wholeheartedly endorsing anti-takeover legislation, since both were wary of efforts of the federal government to tinker with the tender offer process. Law, however, did favor legislation to abolish greenmail, And Shearer was in favor of changing the tax law that favors the issuing of debt over equity by making interest payments, on debt, deductible but dividends, on stock, not. No law to abolish greenmail was passed. While sweeping changes were made in the Tax Reform Act of 1986, that debt-favoring provision was not one of them. And the only regulatory measure affecting takeovers that was put into effect gave credence to the view that the government might as well stay out of the takeover arena, since its rules are no sooner passed than they become obsolete. In December 1985, the Federal Reserve Board had proposed a measure that would apply its margin regulations to junk bonds issued by shell companies to finance acquisitions. Margin rules restrict the use of borrowed money in buying stock, generally allowing no more than 50% to be borrowed. As the Fed's proposal was interpreted at the time, this would mean that buyers intent on financing a takeover would be allowed to borrow only 50% of the purchase price against stockholder equity of the target, rather than what had become the vogue in 1985 to 80% or more. In other words, they could no longer buy a company by using the company's own equity as collateral for loans. It was just such an enforcement of the margin rules which Phi-RST Unocal, in its petition to the Fed, and later Revlon, in court, had argued for when they were under attack. The Fed's proposed ruling elicited an extraordinarily vehement response from the Reagan administration. The Justice Department was joined in its opposition by the Treasury Department, the Office of Management and Budget and others. Even within the Fed there was dissension. Chairman Paul Volcker, who had been an outspoken critic of high leverage and debt-financed acquisitions, was the measure's driving force, but the two Reagan appointees to the Fed's Board of Governors, Vice Chairman Preston Martin and Martha Seeger, both dissented from the board's recommendation. Wall Street was divided on the measure. Salomon Brothers, for example, was in favor of it, while Drexel of course mounted a blitzkrieg of lobbying against it. Even Milken, who typically did not make the politicking treks to Washington that Fred Joseph, Chris Anderson and others in the firm did, tried to lend a hand. Milken wanted to come and see the chairman and talk about capital markets, recalled Michael Brad Eld, the Fed's general counsel. We wouldn't let him come. Everybody considered that bad form, trying to initiate ex parte contact, trying to get in the back door. It was supposed to be all public comment, Brad Eld continued. In February, after the proposal had been approved, Joseph paid a visit to Volcker. The rule was finally adopted, but considerably watered down. The original proposal might have let the government review proposed takeovers based on the respective sizes of the acquirer and the target. But the rule as passed applied only to hostile takeovers by shell companies, and shell companies narrowly defined as having no assets or operations. After all the furor, the rule was irrelevant. One way to get around it was to use as acquiring vehicle a company that had some business, however slight. Another way was to use preferred stock instead of bonds. Preferred stock generally acts like debt, it pays an interest like dividend, and it gives the holder certain rights a common equity holder does not have, but it counts as equity. In the Drexel financed $487 million takeover of Warnaco in late April 1986 by a group that included Andrew Gallup, the chairman of four small, diverse companies, and Linda Wagner, a former president of Max Factor & Company, Drexel almost seemed to be thumbing its nose at the regulators. W Acquisition Corporation, WAC, represented the ultimate in the shell acquirer. Not only was WAC a shell corporation with no publicly available financial statements, but the individual bidders, who were providing only slightly more than 1% of the needed financing, were disclosing no financial statements with respect to anybody on the bidder's side. Indeed, it was not clear who would be in control of Warnaco, should the WAC tender offer succeed. All that was really known was that Drexel was expected to raise the financing. At least Icahn and Perelman and Peltz had been identified bidders, with some investment in the offer through their respective vehicles. It was clear they would control, if their tenders succeeded, and they each had to disclose their business histories. But by the early spring of 1986, Drexel was telling the world, including its lawmakers and regulators, all abject, that it had ceased to matter who the bidders were. It was a tender offer and it was money good, because Drexel was behind it, and that was all that mattered. Drexel got around the Fed rule by raising half the financing as common and preferred stock and the other half as debt. Following the announcement of the merger agreement, most of the equity financing was converted into debt. So much for the Fed. 11. Proven profit, so far. It was no wonder that by the fall of 1986 the Drexel juggernaut seemed unstoppable. Congress had been quieted. The takeover debate would continue, but in academia, not in the halls of Congress. And the Fed's action had been rendered impotent. The force in this country buying high-yield securities has overpowered all regulation. Milken had announced to a group of pension fund managers and others in April 1986, as reported in the Washington Post. The investors have recognized increased value, and those financial institutions who dare to move into this area have been well rewarded. Indeed, free of any constraints, Milken's machine was working like a dream. And his critics, many of whom had been prophesying a debt-triggered doomsday for the last 2 years or so, were twisting in the wind. One of the most thoughtful was James Grant, editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer, who had carved out his anti-junk position back in September 1984. Grant explained that he had reached this point of view, FI-RST, because the world even at that time was long on debt and short on equity. And he followed the old investment adage that one should own the thing in short supply and shun the thing in surplus. What an illiquid world needs is cash, he reasoned, and so the debt security to own, if one chooses to own debt at all, is the one with the highest ratio of cash FL to interest expense, not, in other words, the junk securities of companies which typically have little financial leeway. Second, Grant reasoned that the holdings of junk bonds were so concentrated in a handful of institutions, Milken's inner circle, which issued bonds and bought each other's paper, as to invalidate the argument of safety through diversification in one's portfolio. And, third, he declared that the junk idea had been carried too far, and that a faddishness had grown around its progenitor and proselytizer, Milken. Thus, Grant declared in September 1984, "Our hunch is that, in some basic way, junk has had its day." 2 months later, in November 1984, when Drexel refinanced John Kluge's leveraged buyout of the Metromedia Broadcasting Corporation and issued $1.30 billion of junk bonds, then the largest junk issue ever, Grant had sounded the alarms. He quoted extensively from the prospectus, which said, in the plain, daunting language that would thenceforth become junk boilerplate, that the company might not be able to pay its investors their interest or, for that matter, their principal. Grant's concern, however, was apparently not shared by the buyers, who grabbed up the Metromedia bonds, some of which promised, if all went well, interest of 155/8%. 6 months later, Grant was eating crow. In May 1985, Rupert Murdoch, the publishing magnate, bid $2 billion for the Metromedia television stations, not the radio stations. And he agreed to assume the whole Kluge debt, and pay some $650 million besides, for the television assets. In a mere 6 months, the value of the stations had appreciated by $650 million. This, Grant noted rightly, had added vitality to the already prevalent investment outlook that assumed not a recession but prosperity, that counted on something good just around the corner to make the balance sheet balance. Hot on the heels of Murdoch Metromedia came Storer Communications, at $1.93 billion, further testament to this kind of investment faith. Like Metromedia, Storer did not have enough money to meet its FI/XED charges out of cash FLO, and like Metromedia, it contained a healthy quantity of zero-coupon bonds, 1/3 of the total, in its mix of securities. The zero-coupon bond was vital to these deals. Sold at a discount from its face value, it requires no interest payments, hence, zero coupon, until maturity, when the annual accrued interest and the principal are paid out. Drexel had pioneered the heavy use of zero-coupon bonds in junk deals, especially in the communications industry, where the company in the foreseeable future could not make its interest payments. The day of reckoning for many of these deals, with securities issued in 1985 and 1986, would be years away. Now, in early fall 1986, Grant was still in print, and unswerving. He articulated a theory of a credit cycle in debt expansions, in which a gradual shift from vigilance to recklessness in lending and borrowing takes place, and he postulated that the current cycle had reached the reckless, or manic, phase. In this phase, the public competes frenziedly for securities of higher and higher yield, and poorer quality. Using the junk mutual funds as a benchmark, Grant pointed out that as recently as 1982, only 45% of the fund's holdings had comprised bonds rated single B or lower, or not rated at all, and as of mid-1986 such securities made up 68% of those funds' portfolios. Edward Altman, a finance professor at New York University who wrote a book entitled Investing in Junk Bonds, also asserts that credit quality of new issues, after improving over the 1978 to 1984 period, began to deteriorate in 1985. And Gail Hessel of Standard & Poor's asserted in Businessweek in November 1986 that within the junk universe the new issues were at the lower end of credit quality. It was noteworthy that at the same time that junk was becoming junkier, it had been comprising a growing percentage of the entire corporate debt market. A total of $50 billion of junk was issued in 1985–86. Junk rose from 11% of the total corporate debt issued in 1982 to 24% in 1985. This does not include all the debt that was downgraded into the junk nether regions, $20 billion over the 1985–86 period, much of it as a result of takeovers and buyouts. By year-end 1986, the junk market had grown from $15 billion a decade earlier to about $125 billion. If the quality of junk was deteriorating, one would expect there to be an increasing number of defaults, although the junkiest of issues, being the most recent, would not yet have had time to go into the can. For the period 1978 to 1985, the average default rate as a percentage of the junk debt outstanding was 1.222%. The year with the highest default rate was 1982, with 3.12%. 1980 FIV, by comparison, had only 1.68%. But then in July 1986 came the fall of LTV Corporation, the largest bankruptcy ever, which helped to produce a 1986 default rate of 3.394%, marginally higher than the 1982 rate and the highest ever since 1970, when Milken was a newly hired researcher and trader of arcane bonds at Drexel Firestone. While 1985 had seen a par face value of defaulting debt of $992 million, in 1986 it was $3.20 billion. LTV, whose defaulted debt had been underwritten by Lehman, not Drexel, caused some nervousness among junk bond investors. But there was no rush to sell from institutional investors, No large withdrawals from the FTY or so high-yield funds investing about $20 billion. In other words, none of the panic that leads to distress selling, that triggers further panic, that causes a market to collapse. And within about 2 weeks, the junk market rallied to its pre-LTV state. Thus LTV was perceived as, and quickly became, an isolated event. It was one that caught even Milken off guard, since he had not believed that a major steel company would go into bankruptcy. When one of Drexel's senior investment bankers told a client that Milken had taken an $11 million loss on LTV, the client, in perfect sync with the Drexel mood in summer '86, quipped, "Lunch money." It is true that by the fall of 1986 there was a growing chorus of business analysts worrying about the amount of debt in this country and the signs of strain it was causing, in the increasing numbers of loan defaults, bankruptcies, bank failures and savings and loan closings. By the end of 1986, total debt, federal plus other borrowing, would top $7 trillion, up nearly $1 trillion in 1 year. Debt would total 1.7 times gross national product, the highest such ratio since the worst years of the Depression. The market value debt to equity percentage, a key measure of the corporate debt burden, was 71.4% for 1985. That compared with 35.3% in 1961, 46.7% in 1971, 91.1% in 1974, and 70% in 1981. But the concern of these business analysts tended to be global, running the gamut from federal debt to corporate to consumer, and was not focused particularly on Milken and his enclave in Beverly Hills. It could not reasonably be, because their debt was not a problem, leverage was not a problem, the thrifts that were failing were not Milken's protégés, and the deals that were going into default in the main were not his, either. Many of the most highly leveraged acquisitions that he had backed were now refinancing their debt at lower rates. Taking advantage of the surging bull market, many were replacing straight bonds with either convertible bonds or equity. Equitize, in fact, was the new slogan at Drexel. By the end of 1987, Drexel would say that almost $22 billion in public high-yield debt had been retired in 1985 to 87, during which time about $99 billion of such debt was issued. Despite these signs of growing stability in Milken's empire, the Isaiahs of the financial world were still proclaiming that the Milken experiment had worked so far only because interest rates had gone down and the stock market had continued to soar. But when the next recession came, they declared darkly, that empire would be shown to be made of mirrors. Some of Milken's rival investment bankers too suggested that he, with the help of his and his group's capital, and Drexel's, and that of his ever-ready inner circle, had been able to create the illusion of a thriving supply and demand market, by fishing the trouble spots and providing liquidity when and where it was needed. When the recession came, they predicted, even Milken at the controls, with all his machinations and his billions of dollars of capital, would not be able to forestall a tidal wave of defaults. In the fall of 1986, however, that recession, which was indeed the necessary test for Milken's grand design, was nowhere in sight. And the critics, who in the face of Milken's success had begun to sound niggling, were all but drowned out. A spate of magazine articles about Milken appeared, rivaling each other in the lavishness of their praise. Forbes, which in 1984 had featured a cover showing Milken and his favored, Fred Carr, Tom Spiegel, Saul Steinberg and others, riding a merry-go-round, with an accompanying article by reporters Alan Sloan and Howard Rudnitsky that detailed the interlockings of his network, now published a piece, by the same reporters, laced with admiration and entitled, "A One-Man Revolution." Businessweek, with Milken on its cover, quoted Harvard Business School professor Samuel Hayes comparing Milken to J.P. Morgan and ran an editorial headed, "Junk Bonds Deserve a Little Respect." For Institutional Investor, the headline said it all: Milken the Magnificent. Even The Economist, that sober periodical, gave its imprimatur to Milken's accomplishments in November 1986. In an editorial, in defense of Raiders, its editors essentially sided with the President's Council of Economic Advisers. The editorial declared that the Raiders in their junk bond financed acquisitions were helping to make American business leaner and more competitive, instituting operating efficiencies through better management. The assumption of debt, it noted, is not necessarily Professor L-Igate but can, in fact, as Milken had been repeating in his tireless litany year after year, impose a most wondrous discipline. All these plaudits did nothing to mellow Milken or soften his iconoclastic edge. Overriding conference idents, the utter conviction of his rightness, had been his insignia even when he was a 22-year-old summer intern at Drexel Firestone in Philadelphia and wanted to bring salvation to that Phi RM's beleaguered back-off ICE. Now, after more than a decade of having preached his unorthodox gospel about low-rated bonds, after having pioneered their issuance, eliciting first the disdain and later the antipathy of the corporate establishment, Milken had the certitude of the proven prophet. That he had been so right about so much, while others were so wrong, was a point that no one who listened to the few speeches he had given in early 1986 was allowed to ignore. His recurrent theme was, perception versus reality, or, put more bluntly, how he could see what most of the world could not. Self-serving as it was, he had in fact built his legendary career and fortune upon this ability, first, in seeing the creditworthiness of companies that the rating agencies deemed junk, and later in seeing the undervalued assets of companies that were candidates for buyouts or takeovers. His was the clairvoyance of the outsider. He held himself apart from the mainstream. He had become both prophet and engineer of change. And that was why, he believed, resistance to his endeavors had lately been so violent. "We're faced with change," Milken told a group of money managers in Boston in February 1986. "And all of us have resisted this change. Our regulators have resisted change. Our politicians have resisted change. Portfolio managers have resisted change. Traders have resisted change. Salesmen have resisted change." We're not willing to recognize that James Dean, in the movie The Giant, was really the person who was financially strong, not Rock Hudson. That many of our money center banks today are financially weak, even though we might perceive them to be strong. That many of the insurance companies in the United States that are considered to be mavericks are the strong insurance companies today, not the weak. That many of the savings and loans, who have used different investment techniques, and different ways to build their capital structures, will be the survivors and the strong savings and loans of the future, not the weak. Why are they not accurately perceived? Because their customs, their methods, their personalities, their people, are not the way they were in the past, and are not immediately accepted. Often, what's old is weak and what's new is strong. The common perception is that capital is scarce, Milken declared in his time-worn message, but in fact capital is abundant, it is vision that is scarce. In a favorite exercise, Milken offered example after example of disastrous investments of excess cash made by those blue-chip companies rated AAA, the companies he had always disdained. The major international oil companies have had from $2 billion to $7 billion in excess cash for a 10 to 20-year period, he said. Exxon squandered perhaps as much as $3 billion in its foray into information systems. Standard of California made an $8 billion bid for a company named American Metal Climax which, had it been accepted, would have caused Standard to lose $12 billion. Atlantic Rich IL'd lost in excess of $2 billion in the metals business. So we see here, Milken drew the moral, excess capital is not strength. It leads to the opportunity of weakness. But if one has vision, the results are very different. While Milken had not mentioned them by name, his star protégés, Columbia Savings and First Executive, were clearly in mind when he spoke of those savings and loans and insurance companies that are today's mavericks and would be the strong institutions of the future. Now he tallied his triumphs. Even though Forbes magazine would have us believe otherwise, Mr. Perelman, who runs Pantry Pride today, seems to have had the ability of knowing what to do with his money. In the last 6 to 7 years, not only has he taken a few $1 million and purchased McAndrews and Forbes, and then bought Wilbur Chocolates, and then took the company private, and then bought Consolidated Cigar, and then bought Technicolor, but he has subsequently invested money in Pantry Pride. Pantry Pride was only selling at 3 3/4 before Mr. Perelman took it over, and is now selling somewhere between 11 and 12, in a matter of less than 1 year. Why? Because a management team has been brought to bear, which was willing to take the risk, who had the vision of value, and to find the backing of you in this room and other institutional investors around the country, willing to loan them money with the understanding that they had to commit to repay your interest and principal, and have the vision or foresight, which was the scarce resource, to identify those assets that are undervalued in the marketplace, the difference between a perception and the reality, and to use your money wisely. Forbes magazine, I don't mean to dwell on their articles, recently wrote about 2 people who run a company called Triangle, who took advantage of the poor unsuspecting public, I don't know how, and bought National Can. Anyone in this room, anyone at Drexel Burnham, anyone could have bought National Can. It required a down payment of $100 million in equity, $490 million in debt. Today the company will make in 1986 probably $140 to $150 million from operations, and the stock of the public company that bought it has increased 4-fold. So, Milken summed up, the opportunities are there. The question is, who sees the value? A rhetorical question if ever there was one. Milken heralded the return of the owner-manager, back in American corporate life after an absence of 30 or 40 years. This had been Milken and Joseph's tenet, from the time they started raising debt for their junk issuers back in 1977. They had wanted those clients to have significant stakes in their companies. In 1980–81, 3 key Drexel clients, Meshulam Riklis, Carl Lindner and Saul Steinberg, had each taken their companies private, in the ultimate extension of the owner-manager philosophy. And then the mammoth LBOs of the mid-80s, largely financed by Drexel, had further amplified the trend. On another occasion, in 1986, Milken pointed to the Beatrice buyout as an example of the efficiencies that can be wrought by owner management. Why is this company worth $50 a share 3 months after the company decided to sell stock at 32? This company spent hundreds of millions of dollars on things an owner-manager might not spend money on. The company spent as much as $70 million a year sponsoring races. Elimination of $70 million a year in cash out FLO increases your value by $500 million a year. The company spent $30 to $50 million on corporate image advertising, so that people would know what a Beatrice was. Maybe as an owner you feel it is not important to know what a Beatrice is. You think knowing what Tropicana orange juice and Samsonite luggage, Beatrice products, is good enough. And so there you can add another $300 to $400 million a year. Corporate home off ICE overhead was $220 million plus a year to run a $12 billion business. Mark, purchaser of Beatrice, ran a $6 billion business on a $23 million corporate overhead level. Milken speaks extemporaneously. He usually scribbles a few notes on his way to his speeches, but he only glances at them. He never gropes for a number. The facts and figures pour forth, as effortlessly as though on a computer printout. The set of his jaw is as taut as his delivery. While he strives occasionally for some humorous one-liner, he is most himself when he is serious, hammering home one purposeful point after another. But at his February 1986 speech in Boston, to a group of high-yield fund money managers whom he had courted back in the late 70s, he did make one remark, lighter than the rest, that seemed to engage his fancy. "There are at least 500 people in this country worth $1 billion, Milken said intently. "Skip a beat. That gives us all something to shoot for," he added, with a smile of pleasure that told his listeners he was already over the mark. 12. Milken's Money Machine. In the fall of 1986, the street was FI-LLED with Milken imitators. They underwrote junk bonds, cutting the once secure 3 to 4% fees, and sometimes to Milken's fury they beat him out on a deal. Now they were offering bridge loans in an attempt to cut into his buyout and takeover business. But try as they might, what they could not do was be Michael Milken. They did not have the storehouse of knowledge about this market that he had built since his earliest infatuation with it in the 60s. Much of that knowledge he had fed into his computer system which, as he liked to say, shows who owns securities, when they bought them, where every security might be in the Western world. They did not have Drexel's portfolio of about $5 billion in junk, more than 10 times larger than any of theirs. And, most important, they could not sit out in Beverly Hills at Milken's NASA-like console of direct phone lines to buyers whom he had cultivated, enriched. In many instances created. Buyers whose commonality was that they owed him, and parcel out billions of dollars of bonds among them in pieces of $25 million, $50 million, $100 million, more. In that, he was inimitable. In December 1985, Drexel had backed the bid of GAF, a chemical and building materials company controlled by its chairman, Samuel Heyman, for Union Carbide, a chemical giant more than 10 times the size of GAF. Drexel had said it was highly conference-ident, that it could raise $3.50 billion, the largest highly conference-ident claim up to that time. Ultimately, GAF chairman Samuel Heyman decided to stop raising his bid and to sell into Union Carbide's defensive counteroffer, made to all shareholders, thereby reaping a Professor IT of $250 million for GAF. He stopped, he would later say, because he thought the price had simply gotten too high to make good business sense. Milken and Drexel had wanted him to go higher, and had assured him that the firm would raise the additional financing required to top the Union Carbide recapitalization offer. Heyman recalled going out to see Milken in early December 1985, a few days before GAF announced its offer. "I wanted to look him in the eye in order to take the measure of his conference-ident level in getting the job done. He gave me his personal assurance that he would be able to raise the financing, and he reviewed with me a list of individual and institutional investors who had customarily participated in similar Drexel transactions, and indicated which ones he thought would be likely purchasers of the Carbide issue. Within 3 weeks of that meeting, Mike had delivered to me on New Year's Eve signed commitments for $3.5 billion from substantially the same list of buyers he had earlier predicted would be interested in the deal. Considering the mammoth size of the financing, that it was a complicated hostile transaction, and that it was accomplished in 3 weeks over Christmas vacation, it was a Herculean effort," Heyman concluded. Capital, as Milken loved to say and to prove to the world, time and time again, is not a scarce resource, indeed. but there had never been quite so much at his fingertips as there was by the fall of '86. This was a tribute to his money machine, which had of course owed most copiously at its fount but had also spread its abundance, increasingly, through all its parts. First Executive and Columbia Savings, both of which Milken had an equity stake in, as well as pride of authorship, had flourished and continued to gorge on the junk bonds that had transfigured them. By the fall of 1986, Thomas Spiegel was investing at least $3 billion of Columbia's $10.20 billion in assets in junk. And that was conservative compared to Fred Carr, who was investing in junk about $7 billion, roughly 60% of First Executive's assets. In a sense, considering the enormity of their investments and their closeness to Milken, these institutions functioned as his merchant banking arms. Some who understood this relationship found it amusing that a branch off ICE of Columbia Savings should be on the second floor of Milken's building, which was locked, and could not be entered except with clearance. On a smaller scale, others in this game had also prospered. Money managers who had started in the late 70s with $50 million or $200 million to invest in Milken's junk bonds were now managing portfolios of $1–2 billion. James K. Wood, for example, who had been managing money for American General when Milken visited him in Houston in 1978, was now running his own fund, K. Wood Christian, which had about $1.50 billion of mainly S&L money. Howard Marks, who had been managing money at Citibank in New York when he came out to visit Milken in Century City and concluded that Milken's shop should be a Harvard Business School case study, was now managing about $1 billion, some of it First Executives at Trust Company of the West. And David Solomon, who had started out at First Investors when it was a FL Edgeling in junk and then had become by 1978 the giant of the high-yield fund buyers, with about $500 million to invest, was, by 1986, running his own fund, Solomon Asset Management, and investing about $2 billion. Then there was the Milken Placement Service. Michael is known for placing people who lose jobs, or who want to change jobs, commented one rival. That way, he gets the reputation for loyalty, and he also has all these different pots to draw upon. It's a double whammy. Mark Schenkman, who had Phi RST met Milken in 1977 when he was an equity portfolio manager at the Fidelity Fund in Boston, became the portfolio manager at First Investors after David Solomon's abrupt departure in 1983. Schenkman left First Investors in the spring of 1985. For a brief interim period of a couple of months he advised Ronald Perelman on how to invest, mainly with Drexel, the money Drexel had raised for him in its blind pool. Then, in the early fall of 1985, he opened up Schenkman Capital Management, with Albert Fuss, of Drexel in London, as his 24% partner. By the fall of 1986, Schenkman Capital Management had about $500 million to invest. Schenkman also was now investment advisor for two Drexel offshore funds for foreign investors, Finsbury and Winchester Recovery. Finsbury was a general high-yield fund. Winchester Recovery invested only in bankrupt securities, Milken's specialty, from the early 70s. Schenkman and David Solomon each were managing 50% of Finsbury. By having ostensibly independent managers, Drexel avoided the conference LICT of interest problem it would have had if it had put its own new issues into these funds. And for Drexelites who wanted to leave the firm, and were doing so on friendly terms, Milken often found or created new situations. Thomas Sidurick, whose brother, David Sidurick, was one of Milken's troops in Beverly Hills, worked brief LY at Drexel in New York and then decided he wanted something different. He became the manager of a $300 million junk portfolio at Coastal, a thrift in LA. No one ever really has to leave Drexel. That's what is so great about it, Thomas Siduric declared. If you say you're tired, you want a change of pace, they say, fine, we can put you over here. Joan Conan had moved out from New York to join the Milken Group but never made the adjustment to California and wanted to return home. Milken is said to have helped her find a job at the Equitable, where she was now, in '86, running a $2 billion fund, investing mainly in buyouts. Another of the old-timers, Dort Cameron III, who had been with Milken from the Drexel Firestone days, left Drexel in 1984 to join the Base Investment Limited Partnership, subsequently renamed Investment Limited Partnership, in Greenwich, Connecticut. He did it with Milken's blessing and some of his money. Cameron's partners there were Drexel, the Base family and Richard Rainwater, who was the Base's chief dealmaker until he went independent in 1985. By 1986, Cameron had at least $2 billion to invest, mainly for LBOs. Gary Winnick, who had joined Milken's group in 1978 and had become one of his key salesmen, followed in Cameron's footsteps. In 1985, Winnick moved across the street from Milken's Beverly Hills off ICE to open Passive IC Asset Holdings. Winnick invested about $30 million, a Drexel Burnham Group put in $40 million, and the Base family and related entities put in $45 million. With that equity base, slightly less than $500 million of junk debt raised by Drexel, and bank borrowings, Passive IC Asset had over $1 billion. Both Passive IC Asset and ILP are structured in ways that ostensibly limit Milken's and Drexel's role in decision-making. At Passive IC Asset, for example, the two general partners are Winnick and Richard Sandler, Milken's ubiquitous lawyer and his brother's boyhood friend, who appears in so many Milken partnerships. Winnick needs the approval of Sandler, his general partner, for certain transactions. The strived for illusion here, of course, is that Sandler is something other than Milken's proxy. It is no different from Belvedere, the firm in which Milken owned the majority interest but was only a limited partner, and thus when asked about it in an SEC deposition could profess general ignorance about its operations, pointing to his limited partner status. This was, in fact, the position he took in a 1985 SEC deposition with regard to all the limited partnerships in which he was an investor. "I don't have, investment authority for any of these accounts," Milken testified. Questioned again on this point, Milken testified, "I would not make the investment decisions, correct?" The idea of Milken allowing his control over his investments to be so usurped, however, is simply not believable. Indeed, Otter Creek, that early investment partnership for his group, had a revolving investment committee of 3 Milken Group members who theoretically made all investment decisions. Said one former member of Milken's group who served on that investment committee, "I never made one decision. It was all Mike." Cameron and Winnick had done their hard time with Milken, accumulated many millions, and then moved out to augment their fortunes as Drexel adjuncts. But probably no one else joined Drexel, was relocated in a satellite group, and made his fortune, in as short order as did Guy Dove III. Dove had worked at Drexel Firestone in the early 70s. He had left Drexel and bounced through 4 other firms. When, in 1982, he was rehired at Drexel in Washington, D.C., where he did some selling for Milken, Dove had just signed a consent agreement with the SEC. The SEC alleged that he had sold stock short on inside information for a Professor IT of $22,906.25, which he was made to disgorge. Dove had been an institutional salesman at Schroeder Capital Management when he did the trades that were the subject of the consent decree. After signing it, he realized, according to Schroeder's then senior vice president Howard Quosey, that he would neither move ahead nor make more money at Schroeder. So he went to Drexel. Quosey recalled, "Guy was always really aggressive in his own account, not like the rest of us money managers. We might have tried to enhance our personal wealth now and then, but he was really aggressive." In 1984, Dove moved to California and went across the street from Drexel to be chief investment officer at Atlantic Capital. This was the Atlantic Capital that committed to buy bonds in Icon's bid for Phillips, in Peltz's and May's for National Can, in Perelman's for Revlon. In the $725 million that Milken raised for Revlon, Atlantic Capital, through its various subsidiaries, committed to buy $130 million of the bonds. In the $3.50 billion of commitments that Milken had collected for Heyman in his Union Carbide bid, Atlantic Capital had come in for $155 million. This was the ubiquitous Atlantic Capital. In the Drexel megadeals of 1985, it was among the biggest buyers, if not the biggest. Of all Milken's ready pools, Atlantic Capital was the one about which other investors, even those close to Drexel, knew the least. While other buyers sometimes used street names, probably no other buyer went by as many names or used as many subsidiaries in these deals as Atlantic Capital. In Revlon, there were commitments to buy bonds not only from Atlantic Capital Corporation, but also from these related entities: Worldwide Trading, SSC3 Corporation, Garrison Capital Corporation and First Oak Financial Corporation. In its 1984–85 heyday, Atlantic Capital had at least $3–4 billion to invest. While First Executive's investment pool was somewhat larger, First Executive, like all insurance companies, had to submit a list of all securities in its investment portfolio to the state insurance commissioner at the end of each year. By the fall of '86, in fact, the New York State Insurance Commissioner, who had jurisdiction over Carr's Executive Life in New York, a smaller subsidiary of the California company, had indicated that he was considering imposing a limit on the amount of junk bonds an insurer could buy. Similarly, Tom Spiegel's $3 billion pool at Columbia Savings was overseen by increasingly critical regulators at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. And by the fall of '86, those regulators indicated that they expected to propose regulations that would limit Thrift's junk bond investments in some way, perhaps by limiting the amount that could be invested in a single company, or by requiring that investments be spread among various companies and industries. Tom Spiegel and Fred Carr had enjoyed great license for years, but theirs were not wholly unmonitored investments. Atlantic Capital's were. Atlantic Capital's game was the brainchild of a former investment banker in municipal finance at Shearson named Pierre Wedvik. In the early '80s, when interest rates went sky high, single-family mortgage revenue bond issues began to proliferate, since financing a home in the private sector had become extremely expensive. Typically, in these housing deals, a municipality would sell its bond issue and invest in an investment contract with the proceeds, which would remain in that investment contract until they were needed to purchase mortgages. That contract, which had to be provided by an institution with a high investment grade rating, promised to pay a certain rate of interest on the funds, and to repay the principal in an allotted period of time. In most of these housing deals, the bulk of the funds were moved out of the investment contracts and used either to purchase mortgages or to repay the bonds, generally within 3 years. However, some of the funds, approximately 10%, were invested in a debt service reserve fund for the full term of the bond issues, usually 30+ years. Wedvik's idea was to sell these investment contracts to the municipalities and, somehow, make a big spread between the rate he had to pay and what he made on his investments. An arbitrage. All he needed was an institution with a high investment grade rating, and a crackerjack investment strategy. An AA rating was provided through a Mexican named Rodrigo Rocha, who in 1981 had taken over a Bermuda-based reinsurance company, Clarendon. Rocha's cohort at Clarendon was Erkki Pesonen, then chairman of Kansa General Insurance Company in Helsinki, Finland. Kansa owned about 35% of Clarendon. Kansa was also a member of a pool of reinsurers for First Stratford, the reinsurance company formed in 1982 and owned primarily by a Milken Group and First Executive. Most important, Kansa had an AA rating from Standard & Poor's. So Atlantic Capital was created, as a subsidiary of Clarendon. Atlantic Capital issued the investment contract, which was backed by Clarendon, which was covered by a cut-through agreement, assuming liability from Kansa. That, however, was only half the farrago. The other was an investment strategy. And that, as Wedvik and Rocha soon discovered, they did not have. When they started selling these investment contracts in 1982, they invested the money in treasuries, which they attempted to hedge. They lost their asses on that, recalled one former Drexel executive. I remember going to a cocktail party in '84. And Rodrigo was introducing his hedge guy from Stanford, who had all these computer models. About 4 or 5 months later, I heard they took a really big hit. By mid-'84, they had moved to Milken's junk, bonds and preferred stock. Now they were making a spread of at least 400 to 500 basis points. There are 100 basis points in 1 percentage point, sometimes as much as 1,000. They would promise a return of 8% or so and then invest the money in junk that was paying 13 to 18%. Guy Dove came to be their trader, and Milken's man in the shop. It was rumored at Drexel that Milken had an equity stake in Clarendon through his investment partnerships. But those partnerships were essentially run as blind pools, so even those at Drexel who had money in them generally did not know what their investments were. It was great while it lasted. Wedvik, who had reportedly been making no more than $70,000 a year at Shearson in his pre-Atlantic Capital days, now was said to be making about $10 million a month. His lifestyle lent credence to the talk. "I saw Pierre not long ago," one friend remarked, "and he was driving a Rolls-Royce. But it was only one of them, that he owns." When Wedvik married in early 1985, Drexel threw a bachelor party for him in Las Vegas and FLEU in friends and key clients. It was an extravaganza worthy of someone who was said at the time to be Milken's biggest client. In these bond deals, it was typically the underwriter who decided which bidder would be awarded the investment contract. Major commercial banks and insurance companies FLU'd this market in the early '80s. But in California, where Atlantic Capital was most active, no institution could compete with it. There was no disclosure required as to how the funds would be invested, and most underwriters who accepted Atlantic Capital bids apparently looked to the A rating and not beyond. Of a half-dozen interviewed by this reporter, all said they did not know the money was being invested in junk bonds. One asserted, for about 2 years, they, Atlantic Capital, were tearing up and down the state, getting any deal they wanted. It was almost impossible not to do business with them. And for a long time they managed to keep it very quiet, the rates they were getting. I remember I was with Pierre in a restaurant in early 1985, and I said, "Pierre, how are you doing this?" And he said, "We've got the best options guy in the country." I can't say what they were doing was illegal, this underwriter concluded. But it certainly failed the good faith test. If the underwriters were ignorant of how the money was being invested, FGIC, Financial Guarantee Insurance Company, the bond insurer which insured some of Atlantic's investment contracts, was not. One analyst at FGIC says, however, that it was their knowledge of Atlantic's investment strategy that caused them to limit the coverage to $300 million. What was worrying, this analyst adds, was not only that Atlantic was putting the money into junk, but that it was also committing a cardinal investment sin. Like the S&Ls, which had borrowed short-term money and lent long, and so got caught when interest rates skyrocketed and had to pay more for their money than they were receiving on their long-term loans, Atlantic Capital had borrowed short. Most of these funds had to be repaid in 3 years, and lent long. The securities they bought typically had maturities of 10 years or more. It was a game of musical chairs, this analyst said. They were using the new money that came in to make payouts on the old contracts. They weren't liquidating the securities. So there was certainly the risk that if interest rates had risen, in the end there would not have been enough money in the securities, whose price would have fallen, to make the payouts. Or if there had been any big defaults, in the junk issues. But there weren't. By the fall of 1985, it was essentially over. Standard & Poor's finally exerted sufficient pressure on Kansa that company refused to extend its cut-through agreements to any new investment contracts. Atlantic Capital stopped selling these contracts. It had sold about 100 by the late fall of '85. Within the next year, Pesonen, who had led Kansa into the foray with Rocha and Clarendon, left Kansa to join Clarendon full-time in its London ICE. He was replaced by a new chairman and management from outside the company who vowed to refocus Kansa on its domestic, rather than international, activities. And in December 1986 Standard & Poor's downgraded Kansa from A to A substantial downgrade, in large part because of its relationship with Atlantic Capital and its concern about Atlantic Capital's investment portfolio. Standard & Poor's noted, however, that Kansa had already taken steps to allay its concerns. In particular, Kansa General's intention to no longer reinsure new exposures of its one-third owned Clarendon Group will reduce over time the overall role in the company's portfolio as those exposures run off. Many of the bonds which had been backed by these contracts would also be downgraded by early 1987, so the bondholders were left with devalued bonds. Dove too by 1986 had shifted his base of operations to Clarendon's London ICE. In December 1986, U.S. District Judge Owen Panner granted a preliminary injunction to the Princeville Development Corporation, allowing it to block the attempts to acquire control of it by Dove, through Garrison Capital Corporation, AFFI liated with Clarendon, Charles Knapp, through Trafalgar Holdings, and others. Among his other findings, Panner cited numerous disclosure violations by Garrison, including its having failed to disclose that it was acting as part of a group, in an attempt to seize control of Princeville. Panner also found that, while Dove and Knapp were posing as only sources of financing for the tender offer for Princeville, in fact that financing, through the issuing of warrants, would place between 40% and 90% of the equity in Dove's and Knapp's hands. The offer to purchase was fraudulent. Panner found, inasmuch as Princeville shareholders were prevented from discovering that managerial control of Princeville could pass to persons with, at best, dubious pasts, Dove and Knapp. For Dove, Atlantic Capital was surely a once-in-a-lifetime kind of opportunity. Like other members of the Milken network, Atlantic Capital benefited enormously from the halcyon financial times in which it operated. Because Atlantic Capital's gamble on interest rates was so great, the superb economic climate probably meant the difference between striking it rich and suffering a disaster. For others, companies which had issued mountains of debt, for example, the climate may have meant the difference between scraping by and prospering. But for everyone in this magnificently orchestrated, highly interdependent production, and for Milken, its maestro, most of all, timing was key. 13. The Enforcer. In the very beginning, from 1973 to 1977, when Milken's universe extended no farther than to the next trading area, he had controlled the members of his small, clannish group with the investment partnerships. As the junk market began to take shape, he controlled some of the buyers, some of the issuers. The larger that market grew, the more important it became to him to control the whole, the more he conceived it in fact his responsibility to do so. Because there was more opportunity for error, more that needed constant fine tuning, so much more to protect. One tremor could be costly. And as Milken's power grew, commensurate with his creation, the opportunities for abuse in the name of control, of expansionism, of disciplining the intransigent, of uprooting the indolent entrenched, also increased. It was for the greater good. He remarked to someone once that there was no corporate democracy in this country and there never would be unless it was forced. Milken was, self-appointed, the enforcer. It is axiomatic that the more powerful one is, the easier control becomes. As Milken became exponentially more powerful than the vast majority of his clients, many would not challenge him. And so he could gouge them, freely. As one Drexel employee said, "Mike is always saying, if we can't make money from, that means overcharge, our friends, who can we make money from?" Norman Alexander, the chairman of Sun Chemical Corporation, met Milken in the mid-70s when Milken sold him some of Rickles' Rapid American bonds. "I remember meeting Mike in Schrafft's, and him showing me all the companies, whose bonds he was trading, on one sheet," recalled Alexander. He had made a market in these bonds. He had organized himself among the players so that he could take you out when you wanted to be taken out, either because he had the capital or because he had the place to put it. Alexander added that through the last 15 years, that liquidity has remained constant. So far, he's always been there, and he's been able to provide whatever oil was needed. Once the original issue market started, Sun Chemical became one of Milken's early issuers, doing a $50 million offering of junk bonds in 1978. Alexander remained a satisfied customer of Milken's through the years, investing personally in some of the supraleveraged acquisitions when they came along. On these deals, he said that he, like many others, tends not to read the fine print. Alexander explained, "The investment is made largely on your confidence in Mike's ability to appraise the value of a deal." Alexander is a longtime admirer of Milken, but he did register one muted complaint. In 1986, Drexel was selling a small company for him. It was charging him a commission fee that he estimated was double what other investment bankers would have charged him. But he did the deal with Drexel anyway. "Because if I didn't," Alexander recalled, "the next time I would say, 'Mike, you have to get me out of Revlon,' or, 'You have to get me out of Boski,' he would say, 'Oh, and for 25,000 you went somewhere else.' So, you see, you tend not to go somewhere else." One of his clients going somewhere else, not just on a deal, but even on a trade, Milken took as a personal affront. And he was so vigilant that he missed little that occurred in his market. One client recounted getting a call from Milken in 1986, when Milken was steeped in multi-billion-dollar transactions. "You people just bought $5 million worth of bonds through Oppenheimer," Mike said. "I could have gotten you those bonds for half a point better." I said, "How do you know, and more important, why do you care?" And he said, "We want every piece of business." One rival trader said Milken's omnivorousness goes even further. "Mike wants not 100% but 101%, because not only does he want to do all your business, but he also is not happy unless you actively trade, churn the account." When Milken had 60 to 70% of the market, no one who intended to stay in it could afford to alienate him. Knowing they were being gouged by Milken but thriving on his merchandise, Many of his clients had what one Drexel employee described as a love-hate relationship with Milken. Even some of those clients closest to him, Fred Carr, for example, actively, though privately, encouraged competitor investment banking FI RMS to enter the junk market. But while those FI RMS did enter, they were not committed to that market the way Milken was. And how could they be? He had created it, he viewed himself as not only its progenitor but its guardian. They had come along, late in the day, for the ride. Morgan Stanley, which by 1985 was emphatic about its determination to be a serious participant in this market, underwrote $540 million of junk bonds for People Express from December 1983 to April 1986. But in the summer of 1986, when People was on the verge of bankruptcy and some of its bonds plunged to as low as 35% of their issue price, Morgan Stanley made itself scarce. No bids were forthcoming. James K. Wood, who FI RST started buying bonds from Milken as a money manager in the late 70s, said, "Where was Morgan? Nowhere. Who's the only one who can tell you what's going on? Mike. So you go crawling on your knees. I was only in it for $5 million, but still. He took me out of it. I thanked him. He said, 'You don't have to thank me, Jim, it's my obligation.'" As Milken was approaching the zenith of his power, in 1985, there were some clients who so suited his larger purpose that he was willing to grant them more autonomy than most, or even take a beating from them in a negotiation. Carl Icahn was one, and Samuel Heyman was another. Heyman is a Harvard-educated lawyer and successful real estate developer, who had taken over GAF in 1983. By the spring of 1985 he had substantially improved GAF's earnings. Heyman was smart, studious, polished, a different breed from Peltz and Perelman, and he was gearing up for a major acquisition. That spring, he was talking to a premier investment bank about its underwriting $150 million of junk for GAF. Heyman had been a close friend of Eli Black, the former United Brands chairman, and had known Leon Black, Eli's son, as he was growing up, so Leon Black became Drexel's emissary, along with Fred Joseph. Heyman ultimately agreed to give the deal to Drexel, but he drove a hard bargain. Underwriters generally will not commit to exact terms until the night before the offering, when the deal is priced, and then issuers are at their mercy because they already have too much invested in the deal's consummation to walk away. So Heyman insisted that Drexel agree to a FI XED formula, with no leeway for negotiating at the end. He argued that the rating agencies were wrong in their assessment of GAF as a below investment grade credit, because they were so biased in favor of companies with little debt, whose managers buy treasuries and have no ideas. This, of course, was an argument close to Milken's heart. He told Heyman that in his next life he was going to set up his own rating agency. And he agreed that the issue should be priced as though GAF were an investment-grade credit. The formula Heyman bargained for was 115 basis points over treasuries. The other firm which had been talking to Heyman about the issue was not willing to commit to a FI XED formula. Milken, however, accepted Heyman's terms. Then treasuries went down 200 basis points, and the spread between the treasury rate and the junk bond rate widened dramatically, Heyman recalled. This meant that Milken was committed to sell these bonds at a rate that was well below the lowest end, strongest credits, of the junk market. The GAF bonds were issued at 11 3/8. In the end, most FI RMS would have said, "We just can't do it," said Heyman. But Drexel gave some customers a big discount. They did swaps, they put their commission money into it. Mike told me later, his blood was spilling. From Milken's standpoint, however, it was all for the usual good cause. Less than 6 months later, he was raising $3.50 billion for GAF's bid for Union Carbide, and by that time Milken had achieved his accustomed bargaining position, on top. For this amount of money, in a hostile bid, Heyman had nowhere else to turn. And though Heyman fought hard with Milken's assistant, Peter Ackerman, Milken remained characteristically above the fray. In the end, Heyman had to agree that in the event GAF did acquire Union Carbide, not only would the refinancings and some of the divestitures have FL owed in a golden FLUX through Drexel, but Drexel would also receive, ostensibly to distribute to the bond buyers, but maybe to keep for Drexel, 15% of the equity in the newly constituted company. By 1986, when merchant banking arrived as the new craze on Wall Street, Drexel had already amassed equity stakes in more than 150 companies. Milken had had the principal mentality from his earliest days as a trader, and the firm had followed his lead. It had become partners with many of its clients. This approach suited Milken especially, because not only did it mean sharing in the upside of the companies he was backing, but it augmented his control. With Milken and his group owning a sizable chunk of a company's stock, and being just a few phone calls away from amassing a much larger block, the chairman of that company would tend to be pliant. Drexel had started demanding its pound of FLS in equity back in the late 70s, when the firm sought warrants as well as fees in its junk bond underwritings. But its amassing of equity took a quantum leap as Drexel moved into financing leveraged buyouts in 1983–84, and then the hostile LBOs or takeovers. The equity in these deals is, of course, where the massive upside potential lies. And Drexel typically demanded warrants, to purchase the stock cheap, as equity kickers to help sell the bonds. It seems, however, that much of that equity never reached the bond buyers. Richard Cashin, of Citicorp Ventures, who has worked with Drexel on a number of LBOs, said, Drexel was developing a clientele in these deals that was rate-oriented, like mutual funds. So Drexel would sell them the bond, maybe at a discount, and Drexel would keep the equity. They would say, the buyers need the equity. Well, Drexel needs the equity. A lot of the bonds are done on swaps. Drexel will give someone a Levitz bond for a Safeway. It's so Byzantine, you never know how much the trade was, where the equity has really gone. They register the equity in street names out in LA. In Levitz, Cashin continued, they said, the bond buyers need the equity. Then we find out, who has the equity? It's Drexel. It's a movie, you've seen it 100 times before, you could cut it short but you don't. Look, we're Citibank, it's crazy for us to go on bended knee to LA but we do. Because we find they're very smart and they benefit 10 ways to Sunday, but they do what they say they're going to do and they get the deal to close. One former Drexel employee conference IRMED Cashin's view. In a buyout, Mike's guys might say, okay, we need 25% of the equity in order to sell the debt. But then it never goes to the bond buyers. Mike's salesmen know their accounts, they can say, buy this, and they will. And the buyers don't even know that the warrants are available. As the competition with rival FIRMs intensified and the options of clients grew, especially prospective clients, not already wedded to Milken, he encountered some resistance. In one instance in early 1985, Merrill Lynch offered to do an offering of about $200 million of preferred stock at 14.75–14.75%, depending on the market at the time of pricing for home insurance. Hearing about the deal, Drexel quickly offered to do $250 million at 14%. We had the order and were writing the prospectus, but George Schaffenberger, then chairman of Home Insurance, said, I have to give Drexel a chance, recalled a Merrill investment banker. They came back with American Financial, owned by Carl Lindner, as the buyer for the whole thing, and they were demanding warrants for 20 to 25% of the company. George told them to stick it. Merrill did the offering, raising $285 million, at 14.75%. It was their old bait and switch, what they do all the time, this banker continued. Do you know what highly conference ident means? It means that Mike is highly conference ident that he's got you, one way or the other, and he's going to change it 14 different ways at the last minute, and the deal's fine but you're not. Some prospective clients too just wanted to do a debt issue, and did not want to become dues-paying members of Milken's club. Not everyone for whom Milken raised money also bought others' junk bonds, but those who did not were the exception rather than the rule. One of the driving forces of Milken's machine, after all, was overfunding. He would raise more than a company needed, or had led for, and then the company would invest the surplus, or, in some cases, the entirety, in junk. Fred Joseph once told Businessweek that 70% of their deals were overfunded, by which he meant they raised more than their initial filing. One chairman of a company recalled that he wanted to raise about $100 million of junk bonds, with which he planned to refinance his bank debt. Drexel said, "We'll raise $125 million for you. You'll have $25 million extra. You'll be paying 15% interest. So you'll want to invest in an issue we have coming up, which will pay 15%. This prospective client went to a rival of Drexel's for the underwriting. Lawrence Koss, chairman of Green Tree Acceptance, a Minneapolis company that services sales contracts for mobile homes and recreational vehicles, is one Drexel client who did not want to play the game, and believes he paid the price. In early 1985, Green Tree hired Drexel to underwrite a unit offering of bonds and stock. Midwest Federal Savings and Loan Association, its then 71% shareholder, wanted to sell most of its stock, so the offering would include over 50% of Green Tree's shares. Since it was such a sizable block, Green Tree officials expressed their concern that it be widely distributed, and Drexel, they said, assured them that it would be. Shortly after the offering, however, Koss said, James Dahl, who was Milken's most aggressive salesman by early 1985, called Koss and gave him a list of purchasers of his stock who would be filing 13Ds: Columbia Savings, Strong Capital Management, Martin Sosnoff and Reliance Insurance Company. It was Saul Steinberg at Reliance who, with his block of 9.3%, set Koss most on edge, since Koss thought immediately of Steinberg's Greenmail of Disney in 1984. However, Koss received assurances from his investment banker at Drexel, Gerald Corner, that the stock was just parked with these longtime Drexel customers to prevent there being a surplus in the market, and that when the stock price went up, the shares would be distributed out. According to one source, Koss then began receiving calls from Milken or one of his salesmen, offering him junk bonds to buy or acquisitions to consider. Koss didn't want to buy the bonds, this source added, and none of the suggested acquisitions was just right. So he declined everything. Over the course of the next 5 months, Steinberg raised his stake to 10.3%, then 11.8%, then 14.9%, and then indicated he was going to raise his stake to 20% and eventually 25%. Koss, said this source, was convinced that because he had refused to play the game he was paying the penalty, by being the target of either a real takeover threat or at least tactics of terror. In October 1985, Green Tree sued Drexel and Reliance, charging violations of trust and fiduciary duty, breaches of contract, and fraud, among other things. In March 1986, while he was at the Predators Ball, Steinberg sold his Green Tree stock back to Green Tree, reaping a Professor IT of about $26 million. The suit against Reliance was dropped, but in the fall of 1986 the Green Tree litigation against Drexel was still pending, one of the few clouds in that fair weather season. Koss's anxiety would have been shared by most chief executives if they were not members of Milken's inner circle. Some did business with Drexel but still tried to protect themselves. One deal that Milken is particularly proud of is the financing he did for the toymakers Mattel, Inc., when that company was on the verge of bankruptcy in 1984. After a $231 million cash infusion, the company went through a dramatic turnaround. Milken and many in his group, through their investment partnerships, were among the investors. Drexel, however, was not the lone money raiser. It was accompanied by E. M. Warburg Pincus and Company and Reardon and Joseph. As Mattel's then chairman, Arthur Spear, explained, Drexel wanted to do it alone, but we said they couldn't. It was going to be more than bonds, also stock, and, knowing they're stable, we were concerned about who the shareholders would be. I told Michael Milken that. Milken accepted the compromise in Mattel. And despite his craving for every last piece of business, after Green Tree FI led suit he may have realized that there were some clients who, either because they didn't want to play the game or because they were unnerved by having their bonds and, especially, their stock held by his coterie of high rollers, were better off elsewhere. But there were some clients who were potentially so integral to Milken's vision that he would not tolerate either losing or sharing them. Wicks was one. Sanford Sigaloff, Wicks's chairman and chief executive, sees himself as the doyen of troubled companies. In the 70s, Republic Corporation and then the Dalen Company, both of which had gone into Chapter 11, were successfully reorganized under his aegis. And by early 1985, after Sigaloff had steered Wicks, a lumber and building materials retailer, out of its bankruptcy, he was intent on raising about $300 million in junk bonds in order to make an acquisition. Troubled companies, of course, were the specialty not only of Sigaloff but of Milken, who had seeded his fortune in the 70s by analyzing the assets of troubled or bankrupt companies and buying the bonds of those with value at rock-bottom prices. Thus, he had accumulated a sizable portion of Dalen's debt, which then led to his futile attempt to exert control over Sigaloff at that abbreviated lunch where Sigaloff told Milken that the last time he had checked he was still chairman and CEO of the company. Later, Milken had acquired Wicks's debt. Now Wicks, having emerged from Chapter 11 in January 1985, had one enormous asset: a $500 million tax loss carry-forward. Sigaloff believed that the best way to capture the value of that enormous tax benefit was to raise debt capital and make a major acquisition. Drexel was by no means his only option as an underwriter. Nearly everyone was eager to break into Milken's market by early 1985, and Salomon Brothers courted Wicks vigorously. According to one associate of Sigaloff, Sigaloff favored doing the deal with Drexel, but members of his board of directors, worried about Drexel's reputation, preferred the prestige of a Salomon underwriting. So Salomon got the deal. Milken had apparently not been paying much attention to the Wicks deal, perhaps because he doubted that Sigaloff, who had made a presentation at the 1984 Bond Conference about taking Wicks through bankruptcy, and who was Drexel's Santa Monica neighbor, would dare to go anywhere else. But in early March a Drexel employee told Milken that he had just seen Sigaloff socially and learned that he was preparing for his roadshow with Salomon. On Friday, March 22, after Salomon had already drafted and printed its red herring, the preliminary prospectus that must be filed with the SEC prior to the underwriting, for the Wicks offering, Saul Steinberg's Reliance Financial Services Corporation led with the SEC A13D, required whenever one acquires more than 5% of a company's stock, stating that he owned 10.4% of Wicks's stock. Sigaloff received a call from Milken, and the two arranged to meet on Saturday, March 23. On Saturday, Mike told Sandy, Sigaloff, what Saul held, what Drexel held, and how, when you combined that with whatever other pockets Mike might have placed the stock in, it meant they would have control of the company, said a Wix director close to Sigaloff. So Mike told him the facts of life. If they were indeed in collusion, Steinberg and Milken at least, and the other pockets, if they were aware of this anticipated action, were violating the securities laws by not filing 13Ds as a group. According to Steinberg's 13D filing, he had started his accumulation of Wix stock on March 12, by which time Milken had been apprised by the Drexel employee that Solomon had won the Wix deal. He crossed the 5% line on March 14 and continued to add to his position aggressively. However, according to a Drexel spokesman, this 13D reflecting the purchases of approximately 8 million shares during the period March 12 to 21, 1985. Reflects the settlement date of the purchase of, when issued, Wix shares by Reliance back in November 1984, 5 million shares, and in January 1985, 5 million shares. Approximately 2 million shares had not yet settled. It seems noteworthy, however, that this 13D gives no hint that these transactions occurred as Drexel claims. It states that these purchases of securities were made, during the past 60 days, all by brokerage transactions. It does not mention that these are settlement dates rather than trading dates, though 13Ds generally reflect trading dates. And, suggesting that this is not simply a carelessly drawn 13D. It takes the trouble to state that a reliance off ICL's 1,200 shares, less than 0.1% of Wix's outstanding stock, were acquired under Wix's plan of reorganization, which would seem to refer to the kind of, when issued, transaction that Drexel claims accounted for the entire 10 million shares. During the March 23–24 weekend, Sigaloff suggested to Solomon that Drexel co-manage the deal. Sources say Solomon replied that the quid pro quo for Drexel's joining the deal should be that Steinberg sell his stock. John Gutfriend, the chairman of Solomon, is said to have been so enraged that he attempted to intervene. He phoned Sigaloff during the weekend. According to one Drexel source, Drexel was assured of being co-manager from the time of the Saturday Milken-Sigaloff meeting, and an investment banker from the Beverly Hills off ICE, Joseph Harch, met with Sigaloff and started working on the deal the following Monday morning. But it is obvious that two giants can't walk the earth, this source declared. And by the next Thursday, Solomon was out, and Drexel was in as sole manager. Sigaloff reached Milken by phone on Thursday in the Beverly Hilton Auditorium, where he was holding court at the 1985 Predators Ball. Sigaloff told Milken he was giving him the keys to the washroom and Milken had better not let him down. The next day's conference schedule was revised to insert a Wix presentation. And there, attentive in the front row, was the company's 10% holder, Saul Steinberg. Sigaloff and he had a friendly conversation, and Sigaloff felt threatened no longer. They were in the same camp. Within the next couple of months, Steinberg reduced his position to 3 to 4%. At the conference, Sigaloff also met Martin Davis, chairman of Gulf Plus Western. Some 4 months later, Wix bought Gulf Plus Western's Consumer and Industrial Products Group for about $1 billion. Drexel raised the debt for that acquisition, and 1 year later, in June 1986, it raised another $1.20 billion for Wix in a blind pool, the largest ever. Its coffers brimming with that cash. In early November 1986, Wix announced that it was buying Collins and Aikman Corporation, a manufacturer of fabrics and wall coverings. And only days later, Wix announced it had completed negotiations to take over Lear Siegler, the aerospace concern and maker of automotive parts. Together, these acquisitions would cost nearly $3 billion. Wicks, like Heyman's Gaff, had been the kind of client Milken simply refused to lose. Each became one of the handful of quintessential players, Milken's giant acquisitors with appetites large enough to be Milken's monsters, as Riklis had put it. To win Gaff, Milken had done a deal that probably cost him money, one that no other firm would have done. To win Wicks, he had used a different kind of persuasion, in this writer's view, extortion. Milken, of course, would not have used that word. He was recruiting his players, aligning them, disciplining when necessary, forcing when he had to force, and reforming the corporate world. Messianic visions aside, there was also the visceral satisfaction of having taken on a competitor, Salomon, a Wall Street titan. In 1985, Salomon was perceived as the most powerful investment banking firm on the street, with a vice-like grip on underwriting and trading. Milken had beaten it to a pulp. The fact that they had been able to expunge Salomon from a done deal was a source of great glee and self-congratulation at Drexel. Referring to Steinberg's sudden appearance and Salomon's disappearance, Leon Black said, laughing, "That's power investment banking. Things like that have always happened on the street, although," he added with a grin, "they're not usually so blatant." In fact, in this never-never land at Drexel where go-by wish lists kept being granted one after another, the Wicks deal marked the fulfillment of one more. In the notes of a go-by meeting back in 1983, this goal was recorded in block letters: to be as big as Salomon so we can be as arrogant as they are and tell them to go stuff it. And at the Wicks deal's closing dinner, held in the garden room at the plush Hotel Bel Air, one Drexel employee presented to Milken, Joseph and others framed copies of 3 prospectus covers, mounted side by side, a Wall Street triptych. The first was Salomon's red herring. The second was the prospectus with Drexel and Salomon listed as co-managers. The third was Drexel's. The inscription that ran across the bottom of the mounting read, as Yogi Berra said, "It isn't over, till it's over." 14. Sovereign privileges. In February 1986, when Milken appeared before the money managers in Boston, speaking about the difference between perception and reality and ticking off his triumphs, he had begun by noting that he had seen pickets as he entered the building. That had reminded him of the time he offered to finance Frank Lorenzo's bid for TWA. "We had pickets circling our building night and day in Los Angeles, until we explained to them that we were just a small branch off ICE and what they really wanted was 60 Broad Street, the executive off ICES of Drexel, in New York." It was an in-joke that could only be relished by those who understood Milken's relationship to Drexel. But in this group, comprised of many old-timers in the junk market who had known Milken since he first came pushing his oddball product in the late 70s, it brought the house down. This audience realized that however much of a Wall Street powerhouse Drexel had become, it was first and foremost a facade for Milken. Moreover, while Milken had fastidiously shunned the trappings of power at Drexel, refusing to be elevated from a mere senior vice president, refusing to be mentioned in the annual report, he was not averse to the thing itself. He did not exercise power in the administration of the firm, because it did not interest him. But in his operation, which was all he cared about, he enjoyed untrammeled power. The trading floor in Beverly Hills, notwithstanding the fact that he expected no one there to work any harder than he did, notwithstanding his unwillingness to refer to his people as subordinates, notwithstanding his having no off-ICE, was his throne room. And every other off-ICE, including Drexel headquarters in New York, was the hinterlands. In L.A., Milken had gradually created his separate firm. Much as earlier, after the Drexel-Burnham merger, he had created his separate group. By this fall, 1986, his traders in Beverly Hills were trading not only junk bonds, straight and convertible debt, but common stocks, preferred stocks, the securities of bankrupt companies, and mortgage-backed securities. Drexel's mortgage-backed securities and common stocks departments were back in New York, but Milken traded whatever interested him in Beverly Hills. And in an adjacent building, connected to Milken's trading floor by a walkway, was the corporate finance department. John Kissick, Drexel's investment banker in Beverly Hills, who had worked with Milken on that FIRST Golden Nugget transaction for Steve Wynn, had built this department from 3 professionals in 1982 to about 10 in early '85 and to 60 in '86. According to Kissick, 30% of the FIRM's investment banking revenues then came from his group. Being in this corporate finance department was still not the same as being in Milken's enclave. Milken insisted that not only these corporate finance people but his salesmen cover the accounts he cared most about, so that he ceded no control. But it was the next closest group to the department. Kissick idolized Milken. "Mike," said Kissick, "is what we would all like our sons to be." And since he and his colleagues were so close to the fount, they tended to incorporate the Milken ethos. Arthur Bilger had moved from the corporate finance department in New York to LA in 1982, in order to be close to Milken. Being close to Milken, Bilger had found, meant living, more or less, on his schedule. "Mike gets in at 4:30, and it's sort of a competition among guys out here. Who gets in the earliest," Bilger remarked. "Although Mike always wins. I'll be with him at the end of a day," Bilger continued, "and I'll say, 'I have to see you.' Mike will say, 'How about in the morning?' 'What time?' 'How about 4:15? Bilger sighed. And I smile and say, 'What am I going to do with myself between 2:30 and 4:15? It was Bilger who in the summer of 1986 sent the framed quotation, "Drexel is like a god. And a god can do anything it wants," to several of his colleagues. But Bilger's excitement was mild compared to that of some of the younger associates in Beverly Hills. They had received their primer in corporate finance from Milken as he wrested control from the corporate elite and passed it to his chosen, the have-nots of American business life. Many of these investment bankers, and, even more, Milken's troops in the department, felt that they were in the vanguard of a force that would change the world. There was no legacy out in Beverly Hills. They started out fresh. It was a real Wild West thing, said one former Drexel investment banker from New York. "I remember, in 1986, one of the young corporate finance associates in Beverly Hills said to me, 'Maybe we'll take a run at IBM,' and he was only half kidding. Don't take me literally," this investment banker added, "but I used to think about what was happening in Beverly Hills as the 5 o'clock what-if sessions." In a sense, the most dramatic events in corporate takeovers in the last few years have come about because some guys out in Beverly Hills, tired at 5 o'clock after a day of trading, sat around saying, "What if?" He gestured, one hand seizing the other. And then, instead of going out and getting a beer, they'd get on the phone and make it happen. Back in '79, key members of the New York corporate finance team had resolved in their Kava's go-by session to merge with Mike. That goal had been only partially realized. The investment bankers in New York had merged with Milken in that they had helped him build the junk business, prospered mightily from it, and invested as principals in some deals along with him. But as Milken's LA firm grew, the schism widened between East and West Coasts. The Beverly Hills contingent tended to look upon at least some of their East Coast partners as ciphers who lived off the fruits of the West's labors, and the New Yorkers, for their part, looked askance at Beverly Hills as too wild, too reckless, and too greedy. The jealousy over the amount of money being made out in LA which had spurred the resolve to merge with Mike in the FIRST place, had not abated. Much of the wealth that was being amassed in Beverly Hills, of course, came through Milken's investment partnerships, and while he had allowed some members of the corporate finance department to participate in several of them, the overwhelming majority of these partnerships were for him, his brother and his group, and at least a few of them included individuals wholly unrelated to Drexel. Corporate finance, for example, had not been allowed into probably one of the more lucrative of them, Belvedere Securities, which was by its very existence testament to Milken's sovereignty. For Milken to be the majority owner of another brokerage firm, which according to an SEC lawyer traded some securities that Drexel underwrote and took orders from members of Milken's group for clients of the department, was a situation so rife with conference licit of interest, and so ripe for abuse, that it is difficult to imagine how it could have been allowed, even at Drexel, even for Milken. Nor was Belvedere an isolated instance. A related entity, controlled by two of the same general partners, operating out of the same space in Chicago, although its official address was C.O. the American Stock Exchange in New York, with 75 to 100% of its capital at the outset contributed by Milken, was EGM Partners, a broker-dealer in options. Among EGM's limited partners were Milken, many of his favored from his group, and James Regan and Ed Thorpe, general partners of both Belvedere and Dorchester Government Securities. EGM Partners was formed in late 1982 and stopped doing business less than 2 years later, within a month after signing a letter of consent with the Chicago Board of Options Exchange for violating exchange rules concerning size of positions. Even when the New York corporate finance members did participate in the partnerships, they still felt underprivileged. Particularly once the buyout boom was underway, much of Drexel's and Milken's Professor ITS came in the form of warrants in the newly formed companies. The bulk of these were in the investment partnerships, including at least one in which corporate finance participated. But even here, where there was joint participation between New York and Beverly Hills, the warrants were distributed in unequal proportions between the two coasts, with Milken's group taking the lion's share. Another portion of warrants, many of them received as part of fees and underwritings, did not go into the investment partnerships but was available for more general distribution. This distribution, however, differed on the two coasts, according to a former Drexel investment banker. In New York, they went into a pool, known as the Warrant Strip Fund. Each year a certain percentage of those warrant strips were sold, and the proceeds distributed on a pro rata basis to the partners in corporate finance. According to their allotted percentages, senior partners had the largest slices of the pie. But in LA, this banker said, Milken distributed the warrants not on a pro rata basis but directly to those in his group he deemed deserving. The largest portion, to the most deserving, he is said to have allotted to himself. There were two separate FIRMs, and Milken's was more of a meritocracy, declared this former Drexel investment banker. He was giving direct incentives. Bringing in one deal could make you a millionaire. It worked on a micro level. You had guys who were really incentivized, which is what Mike wanted. They were animals, threatening companies and making $1 million on a single piece of business they brought in. But Fred Joseph's problem was that it wouldn't work on an institutional level. You couldn't run a firm with 10,000 animals. So he had to institute a different system, where you did well if the firm did well. The schism was reflected, too, in the battle fought between the two groups on behalf of their respective constituencies, a battle that LA almost always won. As one corporate client recounted, the way it works is that the New York OFICE sort of represents you, and LA represents the bond buyers. Part of Mike's success, I think, is attributable to the fact that he negotiates a very very favorable deal for the bond buyers. It was a great source of friction between Drexel and us. We thought LA was exacting much too much. But LA had the power. A former Drexel investment banker from New York added, "It is more true at Drexel than anywhere else that their real clients are not corporate. They are the buyers of the bonds. They feel they have a patrimony to protect. So if you're a corporate client, and you're not part of the inner circle, you are ripe for a raping." Usually, when it comes to a pricing for a deal, you, as the investment banker, have to fight GHT with the client to get him to pay a sufficient amount in interest. Here the FI GHTs were with the guys from Beverly Hills, to get them to a point that was reasonable enough that you could even go to the client with it. At Drexel, the most difficult, contentious, acrimonious discussions were with your own people, in Beverly Hills. While Milken's rain showered gold upon his associates, his was not a pleasant dominion. Some at Drexel perceived him as an insatiable, abusive tyrant, who by 1986 was operating, and demanding that others operate, at a whirlwind speed that no one else could, or should, emulate. Shortly after the April 1986 Predators Ball, one Drexel investment banker commented that it had struck him as a feeding frenzy. Everyone doing deals, deals, deals. So thrilled at being part of the new power elite. That spectacle had caused him to think about what had drawn him to this business, back in the 70s. To me, the appeal was essentially academic. You learned about the companies. You tailored the transaction. Lastly, I noticed, it paid well. But that was like a bonus. The trading mentality is supposed to be quick. Traders are supposed to know prices. We, in corporate finance, are supposed to understand things. But when you start making these deals look like trades, you begin to question whether it's worthwhile. And what I came away from California with was the realization that we are essentially a processing arm for Michael and his trades, and he doesn't pay attention to nuance, and he wants them as fast as possible. Michael is interested in power, dominance, 100% market share. Nothing is good enough for Michael. He is the most unhappy person I know. He never has enough. He drives people by insult. He drives everything, more deals. Michael doesn't care if it's a bad deal. He sees bad deals as an opportunity. You can refinance, restructure, do an exchange offer. Everything is an opportunity. The FI-RM's founder, Tubby Burnham, also struck one of the few dissonant notes amid the euphoria at Drexel in 1986. For Burnham, who had built the FI-RM by carefully husbanding its capital, the abundance of easy money that spilled from Milken's machine was discomfiting. He disagreed with the overfunding that was fundamental to that machine's operation. Companies have been piggish, he complained. It's wrong for an underwriter to say to a company that needs $50 million, we can get you $100 million. I am always telling my guys, it's wrong. It's like a kid saying, I want $5, and you say, take $10, have fun. It's not right, it's too loose. Burnham was also skeptical of the way fortunes were being made by the nouveau entrepreneurs, by what sometimes seemed little more than sleight of hand. It took me 20 years to become a millionaire, not like today, when it happens overnight. When this is over, some of these people are going to find out they're not millionaires anymore. They're going to be looking for their next meal. Whatever reservations brewed quietly in the more conservative corners of Drexel in New York, however, were irrelevant. People might carp now and then, but who could afford to challenge? Milken's hegemony was nearly complete. In 1978 he had announced to Edwin Contour, head of all trading, that he wanted to move to California. Burnham had had a GHT with Milken about it. But as Contour later said, what could we do? All that had changed was that Milken had made the FI-RM's executives wealthy beyond their dreams, and had made Drexel into the most fearsome investment banking firm on the street. Drexel chairman Robert Linton, when asked in early 1986 who was the person to whom Milken answered, looked bemused for a moment and then replied, "Contour, Fred, Joseph. But that's a question that never gets asked." There apparently were occasions on which Milken did yield to Joseph. They had, after all, been partners from the beginning, when they started the original issuance of junk bonds. It was Joseph who had brought in many of the early corporate clients, and who was the superb salesman, and the genuine leader of the corporate finance team. It was Joseph who attempted to make amends with clients or competitors whom Milken's crew had roughed up. When Linton had ceded the position of chief executive off ICER to Joseph in the spring of 1985, the strongest opposition to Joseph's appointment came from Milken, who did not want to lose him as head of corporate finance. In 1985, as the firm moved into the eye of the political storm, it was Joseph who was the consummate frontman, and Milken who was able to remain cloistered. Some of their associates suggested that Milken gave Joseph latitude because the two super salesmen were simpatico, Joseph with his drive to be number one, Milken with his drive to have it all. Milken with his penchant for 30-second phone conversations, Joseph agile and fast on the comeback. But, for Milken, who had so distilled his life that his smallest action was calculated and purposeful, compatibility would have meant nothing unless it enhanced efficacy. He must have deemed Joseph extraordinarily useful. One occasion on which Milken paid attention to Joseph was in Drexel's financing of Ted Turner's $1.25 billion acquisition of the MGM, UA Entertainment Company. Drexel had issued its highly conference ident letter in August 1985. But after the letter was issued, there was deterioration at MGM. And the highly conference ident letter, which drew its almost mystical powers, it was after all merely a letter stating intent, and not legally binding, from its record of irrevocability, was altered twice to ref lect a restructured deal. It changed FI-RST in October 1985 and again in January 1986. Arthur Bilger worked on that deal and said that, forcing its restructuring is the greatest value-added thing I've done at Drexel. Mike did not want to do it. He still could have sold the paper, and he had this relationship with Kirk Kerkorian, MGM, UA's majority shareholder. And everybody was watching, saying, Mike can't do the deal. And he could. But it would have been wrong. So we had to bring Fred, Joseph, in to persuade him. And he did. Milken did not discount Joseph, as he did most people. But in the main, he did as he pleased. And by 1986 he was doing it with ever greater frequency. In theory, the Underwriting Assistance Committee, UAC, formed in 1982, had to approve every underwriting the firm did. On the committee were about 8 or 10, it varied slightly over the years, corporate finance professionals. The investment banker for every proposed underwriting wrote a memo to the UAC, outlining its substance and the pluses and minuses of Drexel's doing the deal. Also, in 1984 or so, Leon Black introduced into his memos, which then became the form, a FI-RST page paragraph stating what Drexel's compensation would be. That marked a subtle shift here, claimed one investment banker. The fees don't belong there. The deal should be judged on its merits, not the fee. It was going public with our venality. UAC meetings were held weekly in New York, with a phone hookup for members in corporate finance in Beverly Hills, and they lasted from several hours to more than a day. Everyone was expected to have read the memos beforehand, and the meetings were by no means a rubber stamp process in which every deal was approved. But after all the memo writing, the homework and the hours-long debates, Milken simply went ahead and did some deals that the committee had rejected. By the fall of 1986, Some of the committee members thought that Milken's increasingly frequent FL outing of this fundamental process was a serious problem. They compiled a list entitled, "Diff-I Cult Deals." On it were about 20 to 30 deals that had been bones of contention between Milken and the UAC, about half of which Milken had then proceeded to underwrite. A couple, for Sea Containers and Bright Star, for example, had gotten into trouble within their first 6 months. Others were not in trouble, yet. Milken had done an $80 million underwriting for Compact Video, owned by Perelman's McAndrews and Forbes, a deal whose sole claim to viability was that the successful Perelman would make it work. Milken had done a $135 million blind pool for Banner Industries, controlled by Jeffrey Steiner. Here the committee had argued that they ought not to be doing a blind pool for an individual like Steiner, a former oil trader and arbitrager who had zero record as either a raider or an operator of companies, but should instead wait until he had chosen his target and then finance its acquisition. Milken had also done a $50 million deal for Great American Management and Investment, GAMI, a holding company controlled by Chicago entrepreneurs Sam Zell and Robert Lurie. Zell had made his fortune as a savvy bottom-fi share in real estate, picking up valuable properties at distressed sale prices. Now, however, he was trying to apply that strategy to companies and had purchased a diverse mix of troubled companies over the previous 5 years or so. But thus far these acquisitions were still dismal, and it looked like Zell's bottom fi Shing knack was restricted to real estate. The UAC had vetoed the underwriting. And then Milken had done a $640 million deal for Ivan Boesky's arbitrage partnership. This had been one of the most hotly disputed deals within the firm. The arguments against doing it were compelling. It was a very large private placement with no registration rights, because Boesky's business changed too rapidly to be able to comply with the disclosure demands of a public offering. Therefore, if Boesky got into financial trouble, there would be no public market for the debt and only the thinly traded, though not so thinly as it was supposed to be, private market to rely on. Holders who wanted to unload their securities would look to Drexel. It would be placing hundreds of millions more in the hands of an arbitrager who many thought was already overcapitalized. Drowning in dollars, he might chase the bad deals as well as the good and therefore not obtain the return he had in the past. Over the years, there had been SEC investigations of Boesky. Though none had borne fruit, rumors of insider trading persisted about Boesky, far more than about any other arbitrager. He was simply too prescient. And if he were ever caught, Drexel might be tarred. Even without such a tarring, executives worried, the firm could be criticized for its conference licit of interest. Drexel would be raising capital, and, as usual, taking an equity stake, in an arbitrage partnership where Boesky would be betting on the outcome of deals, many of which would be Drexel's. If he bet correctly, Drexel, which would have inside information on those deals, would share in his Professor ITS. According to one Drexel executive, it was not only the more conservative New York contingent but those closest to Milken on the West Coast who had argued against doing it. Peter Ackerman, Milken's right-hand man for buyouts, had reportedly subscribed to the overcapitalized argument. Lowell Milken, the one individual whom his brother was most likely to heed, had reportedly been against it because he neither liked nor trusted Boesky. But Michael, said this executive, thought Ivan was a winner. What Milken was doing violated the social contract of the firm. While Drexel prided itself on being non-bureaucratic and free-spirited, an institutional mirror of its entrepreneurial clients, it still had rules which were essential to its functioning as a coherent whole, rules which were meant to safeguard it against financial disasters and/or lawbreaking. The UAC, formed after the debacles of the American communications and flight transportation underwritings, was designed to carry out corporate finance and executive functions, analyzing a company and a deal, determining whether Drexel should be its underwriter. All proposed deals came before the UAC, plain vanilla underwritings for general corporate purposes as well as those more adventuresome ones for acquisitions and blind pools. No one from the trading side sat on the UAC, for Drexel, like other investment banking firms, had built into its structure a Chinese wall, meant to restrict the flow of information between its deal-making and its trading or arbitrage bodies. Such walls had been erected in investment banking firms after the Texas Gulf Sulphur Company case in 1964, which expanded the definition of insider trading from company insiders to include anyone possessing material inside information. Because of Milken, however, such separation was antithetical to Drexel's very nature. Fusion had been the order of the day, ever since the members of the Foundering Corporate Finance Department collaborated with Milken on the restructuring of the troubled rights, back in the mid-70s. From that time on through the original issuance of junk, Milken and corporate finance had been frequently intertwined. And while Milken had at FIRST functioned as researcher, trader, salesman and business getter and left the investment banking or deal structuring side of the transactions to his corporate finance colleagues, he limited himself no longer after he moved to California. As Kissick, the Beverly Hills corporate finance head, told Institutional Investor in 1986, prior to 1977, Michael had never done any traditional corporate finance work. By 1978 he knew as much as virtually anybody on Wall Street. In that same article, an unnamed investment banker commented, "Mike is the only person in the securities business today who can do it all. He is a master trader, salesman, deal structurer, credit analyst, merger tactician, securities venturer. And he does these things at the level of the best guy in each of these categories." You look at the difficulty firms have in putting all these together, and here you have one man embodying all these attributes. In effect, Milken had appropriated all these diverse functions for himself. Just as he had no use for organizational demarcations in his group, because he believed that they subverted productivity by boxing people in, so he certainly would not allow himself to be constrained. For him, there was only one test: who had the best skills to get the job done? It was hardly surprising that Milken, who must have considered himself the best investment banker and credit analyst at Drexel, would simply subsume the function of the UAC and do the underwritings they had rejected. In earlier years he did not override the firm's veto so flagrantly, but by 1986 he seems to have considered it his sovereign prerogative. Just as there were few clients who would challenge him as his power increased, there was only one partner, Joseph, and he did so rarely. Milken's subversion of the firm's authority in the underwritings was one problem. But another, potentially more explosive, was engendered by his being a kind of Renaissance man of finance. While it was indeed marvelous for Drexel to have one man who embodied all those attributes, whose talents ran from trading and sales to corporate finance and M&A, Milken was a walking contradiction of the Chinese wall principle. Most firms tried to erect Chinese walls between their deal-making group and their arbitrage department, which traded securities for the firm's account. In the gold rush of the 80s on Wall Street, however, even this relatively simple separation was not always maintained. At Kidder, for example, Martin Siegel had both headed its M&A division and helped create its arbitrage department. But at Drexel, which had been practicing merchant banking before much of Wall Street knew the words, where Milken had invested for himself and the firm and his group and his customers in the rights, many of which were Drexel restructurings, where he had then gone on to invest in both the debt and the equity of Drexel deals for his investment partnerships, and where he was often not only the source of the business but, increasingly, the structurer of the transaction. There could be no Chinese wall. The only check upon Milken, who, as he had shown the UAC, did just as he pleased, was that Contour theoretically had to approve all his trades. One Drexel employee, asked about Contour's supervision of Milken's trades, answered that that was indeed the rule. Mechanics, he added, can mask substance. For Milken, he said, opportunities for Professor I Ting on his inside knowledge were plentiful and the possibility of penalty slim. If Mike sees bonds busting, lets them go to 40, 30, 20, all the while knowing that a deal is coming that's going to make them worth 60 FIV. And if he buys up a bundle when they're at 20, well, that's insider trading if there ever was. But who's ever going to be able to prove it? That may have been the problem that the SEC confronted in a 1984–85 investigation of Milken. That investigation, like at least two others since 1980, ended without the government's taking any action, and the SEC does not comment on investigations that are thus closed. But much can be gleaned from Milken's deposition testimony, given in January 1985, a copy of which was obtained by this reporter through a Freedom of Information Act request. A major focus of the investigation was Milken's trading in the securities of Caesars World, the gambling casino. Milken, Kissick and John Taylor, one of the original salesmen who had joined Milken's caravan to the west, had attended a meeting at Caesars World corporate headquarters in Century City, Los Angeles, with the company's new chairman, Henry Gluck, and several other employees, on June 29, 1983. At that meeting, one of the topics discussed was the possibility of Drexel's doing an exchange offer, the popular 3(a)(9), for some of Caesar's outstanding debt. Either on that day or the next, Milken had purchased slightly more than $3 million, face amount, of Caesars World bonds which went into the FI-RM's account. According to a trading ticket, they were moved into Milken's personal Professor IT sharing account at Drexel on July 1. Those bonds, within about 2 weeks, became the subject of an announced exchange offer on which Drexel was the advisor. Milken bought them at 81.5 and sold them at 101.67, making a Professor IT of approximately $635,500. From the deposition, it was not clear just when Milken had bought the bonds. The trading ticket for the purchase was stamped 11:05 a.m., June 30, the day after the meeting. But on the ticket was also written, in one corner, as of June 29. Milken, who professed ignorance of the hieroglyphia of trading tickets, declaring repeatedly that he had not written a ticket in 14 years, nonetheless went on to insist that the "as of June 29" must have meant that that was when the trade was executed, and the stamping must have been done the following day because the order had gotten temporarily lost. He also was adamant that they had been intended for his account at the time of their purchase, and that it was not an after-the-fact decision made on July 1, as the trading ticket that showed them moving from the FI-RM's account into his might suggest. Milken is famous for his memory. Members of the Milken cult love to tell stories about how, in random conversation about a company on which he has not recently been focused, he will remember not only how many bond issues that company has outstanding, but the maturities and coupons of each one, and, more, the call provisions on a given issue. Joseph recounts Milken's recalling the trading pattern of a bond as much as 10 years earlier. The bid, the selling price, how much was left in the portfolios of the buyers and the sellers. At his deposition, however, Milken was positively forgetful on certain points. He could not, for example, recall the names of any limited partnerships in which he was an investor. He did not remember why the meeting with Caesars had come about, who had arranged it, when he had known about it, or much of anything specific that transpired at it. Asked repeatedly whether Caesar's World doing an exchange offer had been discussed, or whether, indeed, there had not been an agreement at the meeting's end that Drexel would look into Caesar's doing an exchange offer, Milken asserted that they had talked about FTY things at the meeting. And when pressed as to the agreement reached at its conclusion, Milken testified, after extensive maneuvers by his lawyer that seemed aimed at keeping him from having to answer, that he did not recall. According to Caesars chairman Gluck, however, in an interview with this reporter, the meeting had come about because a Drexel gaming analyst whom Gluck had recently met at a business conference had been pitching our doing an exchange offer. Given Caesars' 3-to-1 debt-to-equity ratio, Gluck said, the idea of giving bondholders equity in place of some of that debt was very attractive. The meeting, Gluck added, was held to discuss the exchange offer, which was then carried out. I thought it was not all that likely that the exchange offer would be widely accepted, Gluck recalled. If we had gotten a FTY% acceptance rate, I would have thought we'd done extraordinarily well. But we got over 80%. While Milken was vacant on most of the above matters, he was crystal clear on others. He was adamant, for example, that he had purchased the bonds before the meeting. He was also vivid in his recollection of having spoken to Edwin Cantor and gotten his approval to buy these securities for his Professor IT sharing account. He invoked Cantor's name many times. He testified that when he decided to sell the bonds about a month later, he had again sought Cantor's approval. Asked whether in that conversation he and Cantor had had any discussion about the fact that Drexel had recently worked on the exchange offer, Milken replied, I think as a senior member of the FIRM and on the FIRM's executive committee, Mr. Cantor should have more knowledge than I did related to any of the FIRM's activities on Caesars. Asked a second time whether they had discussed it, Milken said he did not recall. It is, of course, possible that Milken has an astonishing memory for the bonds he loves and little memory capacity left over for ordinary human events, or for the trivia of life, like the names, any name, of his limited partnerships. Even so, the picture that emerges from this deposition is of someone who was full of certitude about details that would help him but aphasic on those which would not, and who was shockingly eager to pass the buck to Cantor, who had been his loyal partisan through the years. Milken bought these bonds from Mark Schenkman, at Schenkman Capital. Schenkman supports Milken's recollection that Milken bought the bonds from him on the morning of June 29, before the meeting at Caesars World, though Milken would have known the meeting was scheduled for later that day, and would probably have known its purpose. Schenkman added, however, that when the SEC questioned him in connection with this investigation, he was shocked to learn from the government lawyer that Milken had bought these bonds from him, an institutional client, and put them into his personal account. Recalling his days at Lehman Brothers, Schenkman said, at most Wall Street FIRMs. Certainly at Lehman. You could never have mixed professional and personal that way. Buying securities for your account that you were trading for the FIRM. There's too much opportunity for self-dealing. Somewhat rueful about having made that losing trade, Schenkman calculated Milken's Professor IT as $635,500, and remarked, people work a lifetime and never make that kind of money, and Mike made it in a 3-minute phone conversation. Finally, from the line of questioning at this deposition, it appears that Columbia Savings, First Executive, and the Princeton Newport Limited Partnership, controlled by James Regan and Edward Thorpe, Milken's partners in Belvedere Securities, the Chicago brokerage firm in which he had the majority interest, may have done well, along with Milken, on the Caesars World Exchange. Milken was asked whether he had had any conversation about the Caesars World bonds with Tom Spiegel, Fred Carr, James Regan or Edward Thorpe between the time of his Caesars meeting and the announcement of the exchange offer about 2 weeks later. Milken testified that he had not. He was also asked if he was familiar with the sale of Caesars World bonds from the Drexel account of Prudential's high-yield fund, decidedly not an inner circle member, to the Columbia Savings account, about a week before the exchange offer was announced. Both accounts were covered by James Dahl, Milken's favored, super-aggressive salesman. Milken said he knew nothing about it. This was the kind of rumor that had swirled around